Hello everyone, I know you are watching this video to accompany your sleep, so if you like this video don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also don't forget to tell me where you are from and what time you watched this video. And let's begin. The route between Grey Castle and St. Joseph's Stand is, and always has been, empty. If anyone is left on the train by the time we reach Grey Castle Station, they depart. No exceptions. No one gets on. It's as simple as that. Sometimes, on occasion, a couple of passengers board once we reach St. Joseph's Stand, but it's only a tiny little station, out in the middle of nowhere. Surrounded, completely enclosed by gray-green fields and hills of wild grass, a roomed church watches silently over the trains that come and go. They're far and few between. The route lasts for about an hour. It takes us wildly off course, and it's always empty. Always. No one boards at Grey Castle. No one departs at St. Joseph's Stand. I don't even know why we make the journey at all, to be perfectly frank. But we make it nonetheless. Twice a week, every week, we depart from the line that runs between the cities, and we head out deep into the countryside, and we let the stragglers off at Grey Castle. Then, sometimes, if it's a particularly busy night, we'll let maybe a couple of new passengers on once we reach St. Joseph's Stand. But we never take any between the two. It's a ghost voyage. I've been a train conductor for 3 years now. It's an okay job, I suppose. I used to be an editor for TV. That was my real passion. I worked so hard to get into it, but I couldn't take the stress, if I'm being honest. For months on end, it was live show after live show. The editing has to be done the same day, ready to be broadcast the next. I let it overwhelm me, sadly. Train conducting, ticket collecting. It's not exciting, but it's relatively stress-free, so it makes for a nice change of pace, I guess. As always on this leg of the journey, it's quiet, peaceful. Late at night, with nothing to do, no passengers to collect tickets from, I usually sit myself down in one of the seats and stare at my phone. Every time we make this trip, every time we take the route between Grey Castle and St. Joseph's Stand, I try and summon the courage to call my daughter. I haven't really had a proper conversation with her since the divorce. I just want to tell her I love her, ask her if she'd want to meet up. But I can't think of a way of doing it that doesn't sound weird. Just me calling her up out of the blue. And so I stare at my phone. Today is no exception. I bitterly continue my sad little tradition. The time drags on, and I always, without fail, eventually decide that it's gotten too late. I can always try again. Next time. Next time. Sometimes I read a book at this stage, or listen to a podcast. I've still got about 40 minutes to kill before we reach Grey Castle. I stretch. I'm particularly tired tonight. Can't be falling asleep on the job. So, I choose to stand instead, cracking my back and lifting my knees, encouraging the blood flow. I turn and amble my way through the empty carriage, stopping for a moment, resting on the headrest of a nearby seat to look out the window. Dark and sleeping hills, clusters of trees, low green mountains. They all roll steadily by. My eyes defocus, and I find myself looking at my own reflection. We regard each other for a long moment, then sigh as one, and I rub a hand over my tired eyes. I move on, pressing the button to open the sliding doors and stepping on into the next carriage. I come to an immediate stop. What the hell? There's a passenger in this carriage. I stare at the man. I can't believe it. There's a passenger. An actual passenger. Sat alone in a section of seats made for four, two facing forwards, two facing backwards, with a table in between. He's looking out the window. I can scarcely believe what I'm seeing. This is massive. Wait till the lads hear about this. Even my own predecessor. He'd done this route for, 5 years? He told me he hadn't seen a single passenger. Not one. Not ever on this particular route. And yet, here's a man, plain as day, on the very route. The route between Grey Castle and St. Joseph's Stand. I chuckle and shake my head, amused at how I could find such a mundane and, in the grand scheme of things, really rather uneventful development on this train to be so exciting. I walk over to the man, reaching for my ticket stamper. He glances anxiously at me, twitches, and suddenly, just like that, my mood drops. Something about this man has put me on edge. I stop, and I look around the otherwise empty carriage. It's gloomy. A flickering light at the far end of the car made the hair-raising transition from irritating to downright unnerving. There is no sound, but for the soft, steady chuntering of the wheels against the steel tracks below. I look back down the aisle, towards the man. He's fidgeting, sweating, a junkie perhaps. A part of me wants to just turn back. Maybe I should. It's one route. One route that no one ever takes. Maybe he can't afford a ticket. Maybe I should just let him ride. But I have to know why he's on board. I just have to know. He must have a reason. No one is ever on board. Ever. So why him? Why now? And so cautiously I walk over to him. I clear my throat, surprised by my own sudden anxiety. I've never been a hugely confident man, but this was my job, for God's sake. Where has this ridiculous fear come from? Except it doesn't feel ridiculous. It feels urgent and immediate and pressing. And I wonder if I've made a terrible mistake here in this dark carriage. But it's too late. I've begun speaking. "Excuse me, sir," I say, the words coming out before I can stop them, an attempt at a good-natured tone. "We don't get many passengers on this route." I was wondering if I was going to ask him if he wouldn't mind sharing a little about his journey, but my voice catches in my throat. My mouth dries. The man, after a moment or two, responds to my words, and violently. He throws himself back up against the window with terror, sheer terror in his eyes, a hand clutching at the front of his jacket. I take a step back in alarm, and my eyes are drawn to something on the back of his hand. It's carved, a symbol, carved into his skin. I realize then that I have truly made a terrible mistake in the decision to engage with this man. But it's too late. The symbol looks like a capital are made of 4 straight lines, the curve of the R's top half replaced by a rough triangle. I look up into the man's eyes. They're stricken, pleading. He shakes his head, sweating. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to de-escalate. I don't know how to disengage or to calm him down. I'll think of 100 things I could or should have done in this moment in about an hour's time, but right now my mind is blank. So I do what I'm supposed to do. I follow procedure. I have a job here after all. Keep this unfortunate encounter brief, professional, and I'll be on my way to the opposite bloody side of the train. May I see your ticket, sir?" I asked, trying to sound neutral. The man freezes. Tense. I can see the veins in his head. In the back of his hand contorted grotesquely around the carved R. We stare at each other in cold silence, and then it shatters like ice. "No," he screams. And I clench my jaw, retreating in panic as his hands fly to my head, rocking forwards and backwards. "No, it's too soon. It's too soon. I haven't even been given a fair chance. I've barely begun." He shouts, his voice strained, banging his head against the window. "Shake." I reach down for my radio. The man looks wildly around at the ceiling out the windows, his arms outstretched. Does this count? Has my journey begun? I begin to draw the radio up to my mouth. But the man looks directly at me, and I freeze. He glances down at the radio, and confusion looks me over properly for the first time. Uncertainty contorting his fearful expression. He stands suddenly with a quick smack, knocking the radio from my hand to the floor. "Are you even a real conductor at all?" He hisses into my face. "Are you part of the train? Are you human conductor?" I just stare back at him. I don't know what to say. The man sees my ticket stamper, takes real stock of my own expression, and he puts his head in his hands and starts to laugh. Great heaving bouts of laughter that shake his shoulders. "You haven't a clue, have you?" He screeches. "You have no idea what I'm talking about. This is all too much. The lunatic is clearly on some serious shit." I glance down to the radio. Screw it. I'm just gonna make a break for it to the engine at the front. I prepare just for a second, shifting my weight, ready to run. But the man moves his hands from his face at just the wrong time. And he anticipates what I'm about to do. He jumps on me, and we stagger to the floor with a crash. Panic overtakes me. "No," I cry out. "Get off me. Let me go." Pushing my fingers into his eyes, anything to get him off. But a furious grin is etched into his face. He pulls a knife from his pocket, and I tense up, flinch, withdraw my hand from his face with pure instinct, and use it to cover my neck. But he grabs my wrist, and with an elbow to keep me down, ignoring my cries for help. He begins to carve the same symbol on the back of his own hand into mine. "You're insane," I shouted to his face. I try to pry away his arm, try to push him back. But the aisle is narrow. He has his foot on a nearby chair. He's using all his weight to keep me down. The junkie's grin quivers. "I'll be damned if you end my journey before it's even begun," he says into my face, dragging the knife through the skin on the back of my hand, holding it as steady as he can in a painful vice-like grip. His knuckles turning white as I flail, and heave to little avail. He completes the symbol, and he laughs bitterly, exhausted, relenting. And it's enough. It's enough for me to force him away. I stagger to my feet, still in deep shock, clutching at my bleeding hand as it leaks down my forearm and drips onto the floor. The man just laughs. He laughs and laughs in the aisle. And I realize to my horror that the seats around me, they're full of people now. Silent, staring, expressionless. And their eyes are all red. I swivel in horror, looking this way and that. But all of their eyes are red, not bloodshot, not red-colored, just deep, dark red. No iris, no pupil, just dark, wet, red stains. I stagger in horror, unable to even scream. The junkie only laughs. He slams his fist against a nearby chair as he rolls around on the floor. I turn and I run. I push through the carriage door, looking this way and that in terror. Some of the chairs are still empty. Some are not. The ones that are not are all occupied by these terrible new passengers. Eyes of wet blood red, their skin in fact, even their skin looks reddish in hue in their veins. Their veins seem almost alive, writhing and throbbing slowly across the visible skin. "Hello," I say to one with a shaky voice. "Can you hear me?" The passenger does not respond. He does not move or react in any way. I swivel again, horrifying, turning to look at another. "Can you hear me, madam?" I put my good hand on her shoulder and recoil at once with disgust. Her shirt is damp. It leaves my skin stained, and I realize that I cannot see where the shirt ends and her skin begins. It's all roughly the same color. I can see veins on her clothes. I'm not sure if they're even clothes at all. Good Christ. I cry out, movement catching my eye, and I turn to look through the door windows and down into the previous carriage. The junkie has risen, and he strides through the aisle coming straight towards me. I look around, panic for a weapon, for somewhere to hide anything. I stumble down the aisle and my eyes meet those of a woman. A real woman with real eyes, at least, and real clothes. Like the junkie. She sat in one of a group of 4 chairs, 2 facing forward to facing back, a table in between. We stare at each other, with a slight incline of her head. She nods to the empty chair across from her. She flicks her eyes from me to the chair. I notice the back of her hand. The same symbol. The 4-lined, or I turn my head. I can still see through the dark window. The junkie is about to push his way through a swivel back to the woman. She tilts her head slightly, ever so slightly to the left. Her jaw is clenched tight, but she speaks quietly, barely moving her lips or her teeth as she stares at me. "Sit down, conductor," she hisses. "If you value your life, you will do as I say. Sit down, conductor, and be silent." I turn and see the junkie angrily push through the sliding doors of the carriage and sending up a silent prayer to whoever may be above. I slide into the seat and sit motionless. My heart pounding in my chest, adrenaline coursing through my body. My hand throbbing. "I've put my trust in you, woman." I think to her as hard as I can. "My life is in your hands." The junkie strides down the length of the carriage. I can hear his footsteps approach, and he grabs my shoulder. I flinch and make to cry out, but the woman's stare bores into me, willing me not to react, and so I fight my instincts and I do not respond. I'm sweating, but I return my head to its original position, and I ignore him. "I need to know. Are you a real conductor?" He shouts into my face. "Did that count? Did you ask for proof of my journey?" The woman opposite glares at him. She hisses. "Sit down, you imbecile. Before it's too late. Sit down." But he does not listen. He pulls out the blade, presses it up against my neck, shouts louder. "Are you a conductor? Yes or no?" A flicker of pity flashes across the woman's face. "The engineers will have you, son," she whispers sadly, and the junkie stops at this. He turns to her. We all stay there, frozen, for another long moment or two. When we hear the doors at the opposite side of the carriage clank open, the junkie recoils in terror. He lets go of my collar, and he staggers backwards in horror at whatever it is that approaches. "No," he screams. "No, please stay back." He brandishes the blade out in front of him in 2 shaking hands, but his resolve breaks, and he turns and runs back down the aisle. I'm not looking. I'm looking at the woman. But I see. Out of the corner of my eyes, I see them. 3 white figures glowing ever so slightly. They're thin, but they are large, and as they pass, I feel goosebumps ripple across my skin. My teeth begin to hurt, and I shake, remaining rigidly in place as I hear the figures follow the junkie through the doors at the back of the carriage. I hear them clank open. I hear the man's screams, and I hear them clank closed, muffling slightly his cries of terror. It goes on for a long and agonizing minute, until I can simply take no more. I make to stand, but the woman thrusts out her hand, grabs my wrist, and for a moment I relent. But I have to see. I have to know what they're doing to him. I pull my wrist from her grasp and sprint to the doors at the back of the carriage, carefully peering through the door window. The junkie is writhing on the floor. One of the pale figures is hunched over his back, the blade embedded precariously in the side of its head. The other two have their weight on his arms. They are long, these people. They are too long. Their bone structure does not seem to make complete sense. I slam a hand to my mouth in horror, stifling a cry of disgust as the face of the white figure on the junkie's back suddenly unfolds. White pincers, long and bug-like, burst from its face and bite into the back of the junkie's neck with a sickening crunch, one I can hear from all the way back here. The man screams, and with another crunch and a series of pops, the creature to his left has torn into his shoulder blade. It strikes again, and it has removed the arm. I have to force down a sudden rise of thick, hot bile in my throat, but I can't take my eyes away. I can't look away from this scene on the train. Freerider! The man screams, gargling on his blood. There's a freerider on this train. He's here too. The next carriage. His words become slurred. The figure with his severed arm stands to the side, holding onto it carefully as it leaks blood over the floor, and the others, one still with its pincers in the back of the man's neck, force him through the carriage into the room beyond, the luggage area where people can board and depart the train. Before the automatic door on the far side has time to close, I see him struggle desperately, but with some effort the figures push him out of sight and off the train. I see his torn body fly past the window as the train hurtles into the night. I become aware for the first time that we are no longer surrounded by hills and fields. The moors that make up the country between Grey Castle and St. Joseph's Stand are nowhere to be seen. Beyond the windows are no fields, no hills, but instead a black and featureless desert. Rough, low, dark dunes as far as the eye can see. Weak gray lightning flickers in the distance. What the hell is this place? What happened to my train? This isn't right. None of this is right. Oh God. Oh shit. I glance back through the windows, and the three creatures are coming towards me. I lurch backwards, stumbling, and with no other plan in place, hastily crash back into my seat, shaking, surging, but the woman across urges silence with her expression. I try to stay quiet, though my breathing is shallow and loud in my ears. Don't panic, she says. I heard him too. The engineers can't identify freeriders themselves. You'll be fine. Just don't move. What? She jerks her head towards a sign above the opposite seats. I look up, trembling. The sign is repeated, printed across the top of the whole row, but it wasn't there before. I've never seen it before on any of our trains, but there it is, and it looks old. It's simple white text on a plain black background, no other logos, and it reads, "Passengers must show ticket when asked by a conductor. Foreign bodies will be removed. You will alert the engineers to any foreign bodies present in the train. You must ride with a ticket. Freeriders will be recycled. But I'm a conductor. Am I a conductor or a freerider? Shut up." She hisses again, louder, as we hear the doors to the carriage slide open. I am shaking but silent. I'm not even breathing. I'm holding my breath. We stare at each other and nowhere else. The figures approach. I hear their heavy steps, and they come to a stop at our table. I can see them in my peripheral vision, glowing softly, glowing white, hunched thin, their arms too long, their legs too damn long. They hover in our space, and I can't take it. I have to look. I have to look. Just a quick glance. My eyes shoot to the side, and they meet with those of one of the figures. His face is terrible. It is long like an insect's, folded in on itself with those pincers, those terrible pincers hidden away, but ready to spring out at any moment. And the eyes, the creature's eyes, they're white. Why? Incredibly white. No eyelids, no damn eyelids. The skin around the eyeballs is cracked and dark, as if they'd been shoved straight into its head with the tiniest of black pupils in the center. Staring back into my own. You must ride with a ticket. Free riders will be recycled. The words, the commands, they run through my mind one after the other, as the creature's gaze bores into mine. We stare at each other. I'm paralyzed. I can see the other two of them, hovering by the table in my peripheral vision. I feel like screaming. I'm ready to recoil, to strike out, to do something, anything, at the instant this abomination makes a movement. But it does not. The other two turn with soft, sickening cracks and disappear down the carriage. After a moment, the creature in front of me slowly draws back, stands up straight, and does the same, turning, leaving, walking away on long legs. I hear the sound of the far door slide open. I hear the door slide closed. I wait as long as I can, and then I take in a deep, shuddering breath, my head falling into my hands. I try to calm myself down, to focus. I look out of the windows at the black scorched desert beyond the tracks. It offers me no comfort. I turn back to the woman. She's staring at me. Silent. Angry almost. What the hell is this place? What's going on? I whisper. Shut up. She replies. I grimace and glance back up to the sign, repeated over and over above the rows of seats. Passengers must show ticket when asked by a foreign body present in the train. You must ride with a ticket. Free riders will be recycled. What's a free rider? Are we free riders? She does not respond. I look at the sign again. What were those things? What were they doing on the train? Are they the engineers? How the hell are you so clueless? She hisses angrily, leaning forward towards me. You boarded the train, didn't you? Don't you know what you're doing? I stare back at her, starting to become angry myself. I didn't ask for any of this. Her eyes dart down to the symbol on my hand, and I wave it in her face. Fresh blood dripping onto the table as I do. You referring to, are you? That lunatic did this to me. He carved this into my hand 5 bloody minutes ago. What does it mean? Why do you have it too? The woman leans back in her chair, eyebrows raised, but some of the anger dissipates from her expression. She chews her tongue. Yes, she whispers to me eventually. Those things, they're the engineers, but they aren't smart. They won't bother you unless they have cause to believe you're a foreign body. I lift my cap and run a hand through my hair, the adrenaline wearing off and the pain in the back of my hand coming finally to the forefront. Am I a foreign body then? Or a free rider? The woman shrugs. As I said, they can't identify free riders themselves. And think about it. Do you have a ticket? I put out my hands. I shrug back at her. I guess not. Although, do you have a stop? She shouts suddenly, jumping to her feet and throwing herself back against the seat. Her sudden movement and the shriek in her voice makes me start, and my question catches on my tongue. She's breathing heavily, terror in her expression. She looks over my head and down to the other end of the carriage. She glances behind her up the aisle, and she shakily returns to her seat. Don't, she says, hushed but strained. Please don't ask me if I have a ticket. Why not? Why the hell not? What is going on? I ask bitterly, trying to keep my voice low though my frustration is clear. She just points back to the sign above. Passengers must show ticket when asked by a conductor. You're clearly not supposed to be here, she says, but you are a conductor of sorts. I don't know if the rule applies to you, and I'm not going to be your guinea pig to find out. Ask this guy. She jerks her thumb to one of the silent passengers sat on the opposite side of the aisle, reddish-hued, straight-backed, blood-eyed, unmoving. I'm not sure about this. Do you really think that's a good idea? I ask. You want answers, don't you? Ask the asshole. Nervously, I lean across the aisle, clearing my throat. Excuse me, sir, may I see your ticket, please? For a moment, nothing happens. Then the red man starts to move. It's an alien, almost mechanical gesture, but he raises one of his arms, displays one of his hands to me, embedded between his fingers, veined. A part of the figure's flesh, it would seem, is a ticket, stamped, connected to his skin, made of skin and fat. But it's a ticket, all right. No doubt about it. I peer at it as close as I dare. There are no words on it, no letters, none that I recognize, anyway. Just strange, small, broken shapes and half-circles. The figure returns his arm to its original position, and I pull back, rubbing a hand across my jaw in anxious thought. The woman is on edge again, her expression now a mixture of pity and fear. I don't know what you are, conductor, or how you fit into this, but I'd like you to leave now. I'm sorry, but please just leave. I run my tongue over my top teeth. What do you mean leave? Leave where? Where am I supposed to go? Are the engineers going to take me if I move? I lean forwards as I ask my last question, and the woman recoils, pressing herself up against the back of her seat, eyes wide. I'm sorry, she whispers. So I stand. I try to think of something to say to her. A thank you? Or an accusation? Should I be angry she's effectively casting me away? She's given more questions than answers, really. But no, she did essentially save my life, after all. Thank you, I whisper. Good luck. She gives me an awkward half-smile, one that doesn't reach her eyes. Nervously, I set out down the carriage alone, back through the car in which I'd tangled with a junkie, stepping over thick, viscous puddles of blood as I do so. It reeks like metal almost. I hold my breath as I reach down for my radio. I test it out, but receive only dead static in response. I slot it into my belt regardless, and push on through the door to my original carriage. Only, this isn't my original carriage. Not anymore. It looks different. The seats are all in the same places, but the emergency signs are all gone. the travel information. The screen's all gone. When I'd first stood up, when I'd put away my phone. A light bulb goes off in my head, and I reach into my pocket eagerly, ready to call for help. But the screen is of course smashed to pieces. It's broken. I try the power button. I hold it down, but still nothing. Damn it. I pocket the shattered device and take in the surroundings of the carriage. Some of the seats are empty. Some are occupied by the strange red-hued passenger. Unmoving, unblinking, perhaps even unbreathing. The only clue to their even being alive at all, the slow churning, throbbing veins that cover their skin. If it is skin, I shiver, looking once again out the train window. There's only desert. Strange black desert. Waves of low dunes far off into the distance and silent gray lightning crackling against the horizon. I glance at the signs overhead. Passengers must show ticket when asked by a conductor. Foreign bodies will be removed. You will alert the engineers to any foreign bodies present in the train. You must ride with a ticket. Free riders will be recycled. Recycle? What the hell is that supposed to mean? Recycled? Right. Screw this. It's time for answers. I'm going to get some answers, and I'm going to get home. If I see the engineers, I'll duck down into a seat. I can do this. I can do this. I march on while my courage is strong, down through the carriage and into the next towards the engine at the front. Only it isn't there. There are just more carriages. Car after car. On it goes. As I walk down aisle after aisle. On and on. Endless carriages. Many of the seats I pass are empty. Many contain the red strangers. I even come across another person. A human, I'm sure of it. A teenage lad. Same symbol carved into the back of his hand. I try to talk to him, but he won't engage. He doesn't even look at me. He turns when I try to meet his eye. I promise him I'm not going to hurt him, that I'm not going to ask for his ticket, but my mere mention of the word sent him whimpering. So reluctantly, I leave him be and continue on along my way. Dark and gloomy carriage after dark and gloomy carriage. There are dim beam lights across the ceilings on the cars. In some, they're actually quite bright. In most, they are not. In a few, they only flicker. On and off. On and off. And occasionally, they do not work at all. I have to rely on the light that comes through the door windows at either end of the carriage. No farther signs of the engineers. But I am on edge. I'm expecting them constantly. After a long while, could have been 30 cars. Could have been more. I see something new. A man sat by the window. Not a red stranger. Nor a human. At least, I don't think he is. He's shimmering. More of a solid silhouette than anything else. No discernible features. Just the dark shape of a person, swirling between shades of deep purple and pure black. The low light reflecting off of him in strange and unnatural ways. Like water. But thicker, perhaps. I stare at him. Hello, I say, drawing a little closer. The man, if it is a man, does not respond. He doesn't move. I have no idea what to say. I have no idea if he can hear me. Do you know anything about this train? I ask him quietly. A long, thin shadow sweeps across the floor of the carriage, and I jump back in alarm, my fist raised, shaking. But there's nothing there. A second shadow sweeps across the floor, then a third and a fourth. Slower this time. They're kind of like legs. Insect legs. Like the kind of shadows a spider makes as it crawls across a light bulb. The beam light above me flickers. I look up, and the creature on the ceiling lunges down towards my face. I don't get a chance to see much of the creature as it falls. Looks to be made of a similar material to the warped, shimmering man. Like a crab, almost. Or a spider. The size of a large cat or bigger. I scream loud and shut my eyes tight, pushing the nightmarish thing away from my head with as much sudden force as I can muster, flinging it down the aisle as I stumble and fall backwards, hard onto the carriage floor. Watching in horror and disgust as the creature flies through the air and lands on its back with a soft, wet crunch. It quickly rights itself and scuttles without pause back towards where I'm currently splayed on the floor. I shriek again and stagger to my feet, using the chairs to pull myself up. I stumble back, 1 step, 2 steps, as the crab spider approaches, and I turn and run back into the previous carriage. I can hear its many feet against the floor, scratching. It makes me feel sick. I look back and realize in dismay that the thing is right at my feet, hissing around my ankles, and I shout out at it, swear at it loudly, skidding to a halt and kicking it as hard and as far as I can. It flies through the air for a second time, but I don't wait to see where it lands. I take off down the carriage, running, panting. The train takes a gentle curve. I feel it as I run, and I look out the window. no longer going in a perfectly straight line. I can see some of the other carriages, and I get, for the first time, a humble introductory understanding of the sheer length of the train. Carriages, carriage after carriage after carriage. As the train curves round, its end, if there is one, does not show itself. It just goes on and on and on, stretching back into the desert. I catch a flash of white through one of the carriage windows, 4 or 5 ahead of mine. Shit! It's the engineers, it has to be. I've been an idiot. I was too damn loud. I stop, trying to catch my breath in the middle of the aisle, looking around. I turn back. Is the creature still following me? It could well be. Can I get through the doors if they're closed? I don't know. But the engineers can, and they're heading this way, gritting my teeth. I make a choice. I hastily sit myself down in a free seat next to a silent red passenger, facing back the way I ran from. I try to control my breathing, to level it, to become as quiet as possible, trying to sink into the chair. I hear the door to my carriage burst open, and my heart thunders in my chest. I hold my breath dead still. They're approaching fast. I hear them, and there are the engineers. 2 this time. Tall, terrible, glowing, and they run right on by. They don't pay me the slightest notice. Out they go through the opposite door, and I wait, counting to 10, and I breathe. I wait to see if any more are set to follow, and then climb out of my seat, creeping up to the door and peering through the little window. I can see the engineers at the far side of the carriage, scrabbling after something. The spider, the shimmering crab spider. It scuttles below the seats and up onto the walls. An engineer reaches its long arms out to grab it, but it isn't quick enough. His elbow strikes the back of a red passenger's head, but the passenger does not react. The insectoid creature scratches madly into the bag hold above the seats, disappears, reappears, crawls desperately down over the seats, and one of the engineers lowers itself onto all fours, like a wolf, I guess. I don't know. More like a mantis, I suppose, and it jets forward, pincers exploding from its face, crunching into the spider's back. I can hear it screech from way back here. Its legs writhe madly as the engineer drags it to an emergency door in the side of the carriage, and the other engineer yanks it open. It tears off one of the spider's legs, and the screeching creature is thrown from the train and out into the desert beyond. I see it hurtle past the window, still writhing. I make a quick return to my seat and wait silently for the engineers to pass by, but they don't. After a while, I return cautiously to the looking again through the door window, but the engineers are nowhere to be seen. They must have headed off in the opposite direction, towards the front of the train. I return into the carriage with the shimmering man. So there are spiders above this train then. Crab spiders. Great. Another thing to look out for in this accursed place. I glance out the window into the realm beyond. The black dunes of the desert are giving way to low hills now, small cliffs of black stone. Something thick, trunk-like, and enormous shoots past the window. Then another. A little farther in the distance, a third appears. It is a trunk. The trunk of a colossal tree, like a redwood, only larger, and the wood is dark. Dark gray. Branchless, it extends up, far up into the night sky. If I press my face against the glass and look up, I can see the bottoms of the tree's leaves. Or needles, rather. Like pine needles. White in color. The ground below the great tree is covered in these needles, graying against the black sand. More trunks start to shoot past, then more and more, dozens of them, and the black sand outside begins to disappear under the carpet of gray-white needles. The trees, like the dunes, stretch far off into the distance. I turn back to the scene in the carriage and ponder, with desperation, the shimmering man. He's different. Unique. He may have some answers for me. If he can even speak, that is. And I am desperate. Hello. I try again cautiously. Can you hear me, sir? No response. The strange lights seem to dance of their own accord across his featureless form. I gently put my hand on his shoulder, and it feels strange. Like I'm getting pins and needles, almost. I withdraw. How would you feel if I asked you for your ticket? I ask, cringing a little, waiting for the worst. But he doesn't respond. It does not respond. Maybe he's just like the others. Like the red passengers. He's no help to me. But I ask anyway. Could I see your ticket, please? At first, nothing happens. I wait for his arm to raise, or for him to recoil, or something. But he does nothing. I sigh, and I'm about to leave when the man begins to shake, twitching unnaturally. His chest bulges out, then his shoulder. I take a step back, jaw clenched, wondering if I've made another poor decision here in my quest for answers. My wonder is short-lived. The man rises angrily. Then he splits, and he bursts. From scalp to waist, he bursts open, and he unfolds into 4, 5, 6 of those terrible crab-like creatures. Oh shit! I grunt in panic, though I have the good sense to keep my voice down this time. Staggering backwards, I kick one away and, trying to stifle my desire to swear and scream, run through the next door, into the little compartment between carriages. There's a fire extinguisher tucked into a small compartment in the corner. It's heavy as hell, far heavier than a fire extinguisher has any right to be. But I heave it up into my arms, waiting, sweating, and as the door to the little cabin slides shut, one of the scuttling abominations crawls through the gap. With an angry grunt of exertion, I bring the extinguisher down with a crash and a crunch. It splatters the spider with a screech, mashing it into the floor. One of the creature's legs twitches madly. I bring the extinguisher up again and back down with all my might, smashing the creature into pulp by my feet. I feel the bile rise up again in my throat, but force it down, still staring at the twitching mush I've splattered across the floor. Breathing heavily, I drop the extinguisher against the wall with a clunk and wipe my forehead. I didn't shout. I kept my voice down where I tried to, but it was still quite the commotion. Was it quiet enough to keep away the engineers? The sound of clattering and thumping, and a quick glance through the carriage door window answers my question. There are 4 of them now. 4 engineers, all staggering about the cabin, pincers darting out, tearing off pieces of seating as they scrabble after the spiders, all now starting to screech loudly. One of the engineers looks up. It looks right through the window and directly into my eyes. My heart jumps into my throat, and I release a low, involuntary moan. I'd forgotten how terrible their gaze was, their wide, unblinking stares. It takes a step down the aisle towards me, and I push myself away from the door with force, turning and tearing open the door to one of the train's toilet cubicles, slamming it shut behind me, blood pumping. I lock it with a shaking hand and press my ear against the door, waiting, desperately waiting. For a while there's nothing but the distant screeching of the crab spiders. Those sounds eventually come to a stop. Then there is more silence, more maddening silence, and I hear the door to the carriage slide open with a soft clank. I hear footsteps, many heavy footsteps. I hear them gather around the bathroom door. I hear the crack of their joints, and I hear a knock. I hold my breath, but my heart is loud, far too loud. They can hear it, I'm sure of it. I don't move, but the knock comes again, a little louder this time, a little slower. Knock, knock, knock. Please, please, just leave me alone. I just want to get home. That's all. I never wanted this. There is another terrible, aching pause. It's like I can sense the engineer's hand drawing back from the door, raising, like I can hear the air currents move around his fist as he brings it down, ready to knock for a 3rd time, louder perhaps, more urgent. But a scream comes instead, a woman's scream, a young woman by the sound of it, muffled through the doors but still quite clear enough. There is no 3rd knock. Instead, I hear the terrible soft cracking of the engineers' bodies, their heavy, sudden footsteps. I hear them tear away and push through the door into the adjacent carriage. It's distant, but I hear a commotion, more screaming, desperate cries for help. It lasts for a minute or so perhaps, then the screams become louder again. They draw closer, and I hear the door to the little compartment between the carriages open. The screams become much clearer, closer, a young woman begging for help, begging for her life, and the cracks and crunches of the engineers. It sounds like she's being hauled, dragged. I can hear kicking. A fist or a foot perhaps slams against my bathroom door, and I jerk back in alarm, listening as she is dragged away down the carriages. I listen to those terrible screams disappear gradually off into the distance, and I sit myself down under the toilet with my head in my hands. I'm a coward. I should have done something. Tried to help her. And done what, exactly? Fight off a horde of engineers by yourself? You could have tried. They would have thrown you off the train. Or worse. Would they? Would they though? I have no idea what the rules are here. Not really. Besides for that damn repeated sign in every bloody carriage. I wipe my eyes. I am a coward. I glance at my watch. Since departing Grey Castle, I've been on the train for over 2.5 hours. That didn't make any sense. The route between Grey Castle and St. Joseph's Stand was only about 60 minutes. But of course, we aren't on a normal route. Not anymore. I have no idea where we are or where we're going. But I've sat hiding in here for long enough. I open the door as quietly as I can and peer out into the zone. No engineers. Just a crushed creature, my fire extinguisher propped up against the wall, and a trail of blood leading through the doors on both sides. I swallow. I consider taking the extinguisher with me. I try to lift it again, and I can do so, but it's heavy. So heavy. Far heavier than any extinguisher I've ever held before. I look at the label, try to determine the extinguisher's contents. But there are no letters here. Just those strange lines, clumsily printed shapes, and small broken circles. I return it to its spot with a deep grunt. And unsure what else to do, I continue on along my path. The carriage that held the shimmering man is a bit of a wreck now. Purple-black stains are splattered across the windows, the baggage hold, over the floors, and several chairs now sport missing chunks and torn fabric. The silent red passengers seem unperturbed. I hurried through it, into the next carriage, then the next, and the next. Carriage after carriage. The great thick trees in the realm beyond became sparser. Through the windows I can see the ground starting to crack and break apart. Small pools of water of deep and dark blue shoot past. Then larger pools. Lakes. They are connected with streams. With rivers. Fewer trees. More rock-lined bodies of water. And then the land comes to an end. And around the train is only water now. Deep blue-black water. An ocean of it, stretching off into the horizon in both directions. The sky is still dark, but the lightning no longer crackles against the horizon. I watch in equal parts awe and terror as the silent lightning forms instead in the clouds above, crackling quickly round. Round it goes in a circle, back to where it began, and then flashing away into nothingness. Every few seconds across the sky there are glimmers of this strange circular lightning. It lights up the surface of the softly, almost imperceptibly churning dark water of the ocean below. I watch for a while, then I carry on along my way. A noise grows as I continue my journey. I'm cautious, but it sounds like wind. Louder it grows, louder and louder, until I push through the door to its source, and it becomes a roar in my ears. There's nothing I can do at first but gasp, gaping around in shock. The entire top half of the carriage is missing. The carriage ahead is whole and shields me from some of the rushing wind, but I can still feel it, strong in my face, against my ears. I pull down my cap a little tighter, taking a step forward. The carriage was not designed this way, clearly. Where the walls of the carriage ends there is jagged metal, uneven, torn, broken. The floor is littered with shattered glass, broken pieces of metal, and bits of seat. There are seats here, but not as many as there should be. Some have been torn from their positions. There are no passengers in this carriage. The lack of roof or wall gives me a somewhat clearer picture of my surroundings. Looking over the edge, I can see we're on a narrow bridge of some kind, maybe only a meter or so above the ocean's surface. A couple of feet, perhaps, above the water. Still, all around me, there's only water. I look up into the sky. Thick, heavy clouds of black and dark gray churn and roll steadily against each other, into each other, grindingly, pushing against the night sky in conflicting directions. Every few seconds, there's that same strange circular lightning crackling around and disappearing in peculiar gray flashes, illuminating the edges of the slowly swirling clouds in the darkness above. A terrible sense of vertigo threatens to overcome me, and I force my gaze back down and ahead, and with jaw clenched, I stride on into the next, thankfully whole carriage. Then the next, and the next, and the next. Eventually, a movement catches my eye through one of the door windows ahead. I stop, crouching, watching cautiously. It appears to be an old man, a human, shuffling out of a toilet cubicle and back through the door to his carriage. Down the aisle he goes. Then he stops and carefully grips hold of the edge of a chair, luring himself into it and facing away from me. I chew my tongue. Then I follow, pushing gently through the sliding doors. I clear my throat as I approach the old man. Hello. Excuse me. He starts with a grunt of dismay, turning to look at me, taking in my uniform, my face, my eyes. We regard each other in silence for a moment. Hello. I say again. Good evening. The old man replies. Then, are you a conductor then, son? I'm not sure how to reply. Of sorts? Are you going to ask me for my ticket? No, I say. Not if you don't want me to. The old man snorts, then seems to relax a little. He gestures to the seat opposite from him across the little table. Care to join me? He says. And I do. I take the seat. The old man closes his eyes briefly, muttering softly as he crosses himself with his fingers. I don't fail to notice the R symbol carved into the back of his hand. Are you sure you don't mind talking like this? I ask anxiously, checking down the aisle ahead and behind with furtive glances. We're not being too loud. The man shrugs. As long as we keep our tones level and don't cause a scene, in my experience at least, I think we should be just fine. I bite on one of my thumbnails. In your experience, you say, sir, how long have you been riding this train then? Exactly. The old man scratches his chin and looks through the window at the water beyond. Well, must be going on. Has it been 7? 8? Yes, 8. 6 years and 8 months by my count. It's been quite the journey. I stare at him. 6 years? 6 years and 8 months? I chuckle awkwardly. But the man does not laugh with me. You're joking, right? You're telling me you've been riding for over 6 years? The old man nods. That's right, son. 6 years. 8 months. He says quietly. Yourself? But, well, that depends on what you mean. My shift started at 9 this morning, but I've only been here since, well, for a few hours. I don't know what's going on. I don't know where we're going. I didn't ask for this, for any of this. Some maniac carved this symbol into my hand, I say, trying to hold back my sudden rush of emotion. Is this how I board it? Is it this symbol? The man listens patiently to my little rant. Then he speaks softly. That's right, lad. The symbol. You must ride with the symbol, carved clear and plain as day. And of course, one can only board between the twin stations, between Grey Castle and St. Joseph's Stand. But that doesn't make any sense, I say to him. The route between Grey Castle and St. Joseph's Stand lasts for an hour, max. Not 6 bloody years. It loops back towards Manchester, goes on through Newcastle. It's supposed to end in Edinburgh in a couple of hours' time. The man shakes his head sadly. Manchester, Newcastle, Edinburgh. I do not know these places, conductor. I tap a hand against my forehead, slowing my breathing. This man is kind and helpful. It'll do no use to get frustrated. But your accent. You're British, right? You must know these places. England? Scotland? But the old man just smiles sadly, and he slowly shakes his head once more. I'm afraid that I do not recognize these names, my friend. I drum my fingers softly against the table, looking out through the window as the train chunters softly and steadily along the tracks and the dark churning waters beyond stretch far off towards the horizon. The old man speaks again, his voice breaking through the clouds in my mind. The train can take you between, lad. It can take you beyond. Far, far beyond. Beyond where, sir? Where are you going? I ask. I don't understand. What journey could possibly warrant a distance that lasts for 6 years? The smile drops from his face, and he looks sadly out the window for a long and heavy moment. Then he sighs, and he reaches into his jacket. Fumbling around, he produces a picture of a young woman in her mid to late 20s, and he shows it to me. She's a good-looking lady with a nice smile. I won't bore you with the details. I'm not sure how much sense they would make to you anyway, conductor. But this is my daughter, a wonderful young lady. A bit of a nutcase, though. He chuckles, then grimaces, obsessed with the occult. A dangerous business. Dangerous business, indeed. Got involved with some sketchy folk, and she disappeared. Vanished off the face of the planet. 20 years it's been. 26, if you include these long years on the train. Though between you and me, I'm not convinced they travel by at quite the same speed. The old man's expression darkens. I promised myself I'd do everything I could to find her. What sort of a father would I be if I didn't? Began my own research into the occult. The backward shadows. The other sides. Twisted lines that run between the gaps. The old man clenches a trembling fist and lowers his voice. I will find her, conductor. I will see her again. And I've been searching for such a long time. The man rubs the knuckle of the finger across a watery eye, looking down at the table between us as he does so. This stage of my journey is soon coming to an end. I'm glad I had someone to talk to before moving on. Moving on? I ask. What do you mean? My stop, lad. My stop be coming up any time now. I lean forward, my heart beating fast with anxiety and anticipation. Your stop? You mean the train? The train actually stops. Of course. He chuckles now. Wouldn't be much of a train if it didn't stop now, would it? No. I say, sitting back in thought. No, I suppose not. Stay a while. The man says nonchalantly enough, but it's obvious how grateful he is for the and I stay. As the train crosses over the ocean beyond, we quietly chat a little about our lives, what we do, about our families. He talks about his daughter, and I tell him about mine, about my fear to call her, about my divorce, about my general dissatisfaction for life. It all sounds rather pathetic when I express it out loud, but he is sympathetic. He does not talk much about his home. I try to ask him about where he's from exactly, about his place, his city, his town, but he will not give me a straight answer, nor does he ask me about my home, and I get the sense that perhaps we're not supposed to, so I drop it. One thing I glean, though, is that whilst he did indeed board between Grey Castle and St. Joseph's Stand, he seems to be under the impression that the two stations were stops within a single sprawling city, scarcely 10 minutes apart in a straight line. His words unsettle me, and perhaps he can tell because the subject changes to our own surroundings. I ask him about the engineers for an insight, perhaps, into their terrible forms, their staring eyes, their purpose. I ask about the passengers, the shimmering man, about the crab spiders. The old man has seen plenty of engineers, though he knows very little about them. He's watched them throw dozens off the train. They always take a piece before they do, an arm or a leg, or worse, the shimmering man too, and other larger, more terrible shimmering shapes. He's seen the engineers force them out, and into the unknown that rushes by beyond the train doors. Never the red passengers, though, the silent, thick-veined passengers with the blood-red eyes. They're always left well alone, never given even a second glance. He's seen the crab spiders. He's watched them scuttle across the ceiling, over seats in the darkness. He says they get more common the closer you get to the front of the train, but he's never been to the actual front of the train himself, and he has no real answers for me regarding the train's purpose or true nature. The sign above the chairs becomes the subject of our quiet conversation. Passengers must show ticket when asked by a conductor. Foreign bodies will be removed. You will alert the engineers to any foreign bodies present in the train. You must ride with a ticket. Free riders will be recycled. What does it mean, sir? I ask him. When it says recycled, what does that mean exactly? I do not know, conductor, but it scares me, being caught out as a free rider, and every time I look up at that sign I'm reminded of my own burden of guilt. I ask him what he means, and he continues. I had a friend on this train several years ago now. Met him in one of the carriages, and we got to know each other. He was a good fella, searching for something to fix his head. The old man tapped his temple, sound and critical thinking, you understand, but plagued with terrible nightmares. We were sitting together one uneventful day, chatting as we often did, and a conductor shimmered up the aisle, fresh out of nowhere. First time I'd seen one. Not a conductor like yourself, young man, but a true conductor. One of the train's own. A terrible-looking thing. And it asked my friend for his ticket. And of course, he could not provide. The old man looked suddenly much older then, old beyond his years. A deep and reflected sadness washes over me. The conductor hovered beside us for, well, couldn't have been longer than a minute. Then it went on down the aisle and disappeared. Never before then had my friend seen a conductor so close. And as I said, I'd never seen one at all. I've never been asked to show my ticket. So we just stood in panic for a while, unsure what to do and how to proceed. Then the engineers came. Last thing he said to me as they burst into the carriage. Last thing he said as he gripped my hand. He urged me to stay silent, to not give them any cause to throw me off. And they took him, grabbed him by the back of the neck, dragged him on down the carriage and out of sight. And I never saw him again. And I have to live with my indecision every day. There's little to do here but think. Think on whether I made the right choice. Whether I could have saved him somehow. But my daughter is the priority. She's the one I set out to find, conductor. And I will find her. I swear it. By all the gods man holds. I swear it. The old man crosses himself for a second time, quietly muttering some words under his breath. I process his story in silence for a while. A light flickers at the far end of the carriage. The wheels of the train grind and shunter along the steel of the tracks below. A shiver of deep alien fear passes through me, and I ask the old man if he knows how he's going to get home. One journey at a time, my lad, he whispers, as a gentle voice crackles through the carriage out from an unseen intercom. Now approaching KACD. KACD. Then it fades into a low hum and crackles into silence. Ah well, here we go then. This is me, the old man says, and he shakily rises to his feet. He's of small stature, and his voice is tired, weary old. There's no doubt about it. But he does not seem an old or weary man now as he stands before me, chin raised, jaw set, and fist clenched. A circle of the lightning in the sky beyond ripples powerful silver light across his features, and I see in his eyes a determination that sends a surge of sudden affinity, of powerful admiration rushing through my blood. I rise to my feet too, unbidden, and stand there awkwardly in his shade. What am I going to do now? Hug him? Hug this stranger, who I've known for all of 20 minutes? Ask to exchange contact details? But the man grins at me, and he holds out his hand to shake. I take it. I walk with him into the zone between the carriages, the compartment with doors to the outside, as the train begins to decelerate, slowing steadily. A great and rocky island appears behind the door windows, an island of strange, dark, and glassy stone, a scene that sends through me an icy river of dread. The crooked mountains extend high up into the sky, and the island is surrounded by small outcrops of broken, tumbled rock. The train chunners to a halt, and the intercom crackles. Color CD, and the man pats me on the shoulder, and he presses the button for the door. It opens with a soft hiss, and he steps out onto the gray-black ground below the train, walking over the wet stones to the dark and sinister island of rock and glass beyond. The doors quietly close of their own accord. I watch through the windows as the man gets smaller and smaller into the distance, and after a while, the train begins once again to hiss, and it starts to move, continuing its journey. I watch the man vanish from my line of sight. I watch the sharp and towered edges of the mountainous island roll by. I watch its cliffs disappear down into the dark water. The outcrops become sparser and sparser, and then there is once again only water. I process a strange, but very profound sense of loss as I look out at the lightning circling above the ocean. I glance up at the signs that run along the edge of the carriage just below the ceiling. Passengers must show ticket when asked by a conductor. Foreign bodies will be removed. You will alert the engineers to any foreign bodies present in the train. You must ride with a ticket. Free riders will be recycled. And I continue on along my way. My journey through the train continues. I think this is my plan now. Find humans, engage with them if I'm able, learn as much as I can, and hope I can find enough clues to figure out a way home. Maybe if I'm lucky, I'll even find someone heading in my direction. For the next 3 hours, however, I see no one. No humans, that is. I pass plenty of the silent red passengers. I see more of the shimmering men. I even see another crab spider, crawling, scrabbling blindly across the ceiling. Cold panic rushes through me, but I stay stock still. I control my breathing, and it disappears into the overhead baggage hold. I don't stick around. I subsist off water from battered, half-finished plastic bottles I find lying around, beneath chairs and bins. I'm not sure where they came from, and the taste is not great, but it's fine. I try the water from the bathroom taps too. Sometimes it's okay, though more often than not it's soapy and makes me gag. Curiously, I do not find myself growing hungry, but I do get tired. I stop for rest in the seat of one of the more empty carriages and look out the window. A flickering beamed light overhead allows me a few uninterrupted seconds of vision beyond the glass, before my view is momentarily blocked by a flash of my own tired, anxious, reflected face. The ocean is now peppered with rock, great slabs of it, rising out from the depths. In the distance is a beach of pale gray sand that steadily approaches, stretching around in a wide arc. There are pillars of some kind on the land beyond, but it's too far away. I can't tell from here if they're structures or if they're natural formations. And then, the light above me goes dark. The hairs on my forearms rise. A low buzzing noise drones down the aisle of the carriage. And I turn my head just a little, teeth set, as an alien form larger than that of a man, and hovering above the ground shimmers slowly past. It's a conductor. A true conductor. I know it. I'd ask the old man to describe one to me, and this thing fits the bill. It is terrible to look upon. Every fiber of my being wants to scream and run. A writhing mass of white-gray, several long, thin arms that end in what appear to be curved blades of flesh. No discernible, even remotely human characteristics at all. It comes to a stop right next to me, and the gears for my fight or flight grind faster. What do I do if this thing asks me for my ticket? Do I try to overpower it? To run? Yank open one of the emergency doors and take my chances with the world beyond? I glance hastily out the window. The train is hurtling across the surface of the water. Would I be killed if I were to jump into it at this speed? Certainly if I hit one of the rocks. Though if I survive, could I swim to the beach? Could I make it that far? But what if there's lurking in the water? All these thoughts and more race through my mind, but a voice from the entity in the aisle interrupts and rumbles around the carriage. A request. The conductor asks for proof of your journey's validity. And whilst the words send me through a jolt of panic, I force it down, because the conductor is not talking to me. I can see no mouth. I cannot even tell which way it's facing. But I know. I can't say how I know, but the conductor, thank the gods, is not talking to me. A red passenger across the aisle stirs. She slowly, awkwardly raises one arm, and attached to her hand through the skin of her fingers is her ticket. One of the conductor's writhing limbs stretches down to the ticket, and it stamps it with the same symbol as the one on the back of my own hand, the shape of the R, and it steams softly for a while from the mark. The passenger lowers her arm, and the conductor hovers on down the aisle, through the door to the next carriage. I control my breathing, summon my courage, and I follow. Keeping my distance, I watch it drift into the next carriage and ask another 2 red passengers for their tickets. It stamps them, then hovers slowly on into the following car. I keep watch, creeping behind it, looking carefully through the window. I see the conductor come to a stop beside 3 humans. 3. And they're all sat together, with terrifying stricken expressions on their faces as the voice of the conductor rumbles around the walls. A request. The conductor asks for proof of your journey's validity. And there is silence, and one of the 3 people, a woman, starts to shake and to softly weep. The others remain stock still, horrified, and the conductor, after a minute, moves on. It does not go through the door to the next carriage. It just shimmers and disappears from sight. The weeping woman's body is racked with sobs, and she collapses forward onto the table with her head in her hands. The woman beside her has gone pale. She's staring down at her, and the man across has started slamming his fist against the window in frustration. I step into the carriage, and the man's voice becomes clear. We're so close. We're so damn close. Let's just make a break for it. Our stop's the next one. It can't be more than an hour away. Come on, let's just jump. We'll be killed, says the woman across from him, adjusting her glasses, her voice trembling as she squeezes the arm of the weeping woman to her left. I look behind me. I can see a group of engineers through the door windows, a few carriages back and heading this way. You guys need to decide and fast. I say to the group, and they look up, noticing me for the first time. The man lets out a shout of rage, jumping to his feet between me and the women. He's not one of them. The woman with glasses shouts at him. Look at his hand. I glance behind me again. The engineers look to be about 2 carriages away. They're coming for you. I say urgently, stepping past the man and gripping the sobbing woman by the shoulder. For you definitely. Maybe for all of you. You need to leave, please. Just take your chances with the world outside and go. Are you mad? The woman with glasses hisses at me. Do you have any idea where we are? The man beside me lowers his fist. He's right, he says, looking over my shoulder. We've come so far. It's time to leave. It's now or never. They're gonna throw us out regardless. He turns to the women. Get up, he says. Get up. He grabs the crying woman by the shoulders and starts to drag her to the door. Oh Christ. No. The other mutters, shaking as she rises to her feet to follow. I slot myself down into a nearby seat as calmly as I can. And a few seconds later, the door to the carriage bursts open. I hear the heavy footsteps of the engineers approach. Get back, the man shouts as he yanks open an emergency door. The sound of the rushing wind, a sudden roar now billowing round the carriage. Then he turns to the woman with the glasses, holds her face in his hands. Go, please. Just go. You idiot, she says through tears, pushing him back. Go first. Jump and I'll follow. But the man does not. The engineers sprint past me, and the man grabs the woman by the shoulders. Brace. He yells into her face, and with all his force, he pushes her out of the train and towards the water below. We are moving at such a speed that there is not even time to see her hit the surface. He moves to grab the other woman, but he's too late. The engineers are upon him. I watch fist clenching and unclenching with guilt and desperate sympathy as the man and woman struggle against the engineers. The man is doing his best against 2 of them as they drag him around the cabin, cracking their limbs on poles and rails as he bellows in anguish. The woman is set upon by only a single engineer at first, and to my surprise, she manages through the strength of some hidden away force to shove it back towards the open door. The man staggers backwards against the engineer, clutching his neck, and the weight of the party crashes into the engineer by the door, and the monster is pushed clumsily into the world beyond pincers, darting out as it falls, but catching on nothing but air falling from the train and disappearing out of sight. The woman tries to wrestle one of the remaining engineers off of the man screaming, but she staggers back in horror as its pincers unfold from its face and crunch into the man's shoulder. He thrashes, shouting to the woman to jump, but she's unable. The second engineer darts behind her, clambering up the rail and the wall to take hold of her, locking her in place as she struggles. Blood gushes out onto the floor across the engineer's legs and over the man's torso. The engineer holding the woman turns his head and darts out his own pincers, latching onto the man's side, tearing off a chunk of flesh with a sickening wet rip of a sound. The man shouts something unintelligible, and the engineer behind him with its pincers still in his shoulder braces itself against the rail and forces the man through the door and throws him off the train. It draws the door closed with a loud bang, and the rush of the wind in my ears is silenced. I watch in horror, my heart hammering, as the engineer set off down the train. One of them holds the screaming woman tight in its grip. She flails, slamming her fist against the engineer's body again and again. She catches my eye. "Help me!" she screams. "Please help me." I sink into my chair, panic, but the engineers pay no mind. They drag her on towards the front of the carriage and through the doors into the next as she kicks and screams, and I think. I think hard and I think fast. I try to draw strength from my palaver with the old man. I try to take hold of a second-hand burst of courage, and I stand shakily. I stand, and as if on someone else's legs I march down the aisle. I'm going after her. I'm going to act. Passengers must show ticket when asked by a conductor. Foreign bodies will be removed. You will alert the engineers to any foreign bodies present in the train. You must ride with a ticket. Free riders will be recycled. I can only presume that the woman I now follow is going to be recycled, whatever horrors that may entail. She is a free rider like the others, and she has been identified as such. I dart down the aisle, trying to remain as inconspicuous as I can. The woman has seen me follow, but the engineers have not. She screams and babbles, kicking and fighting, and I can only pray that she does not give away what I am trying to do in her panic. The engineers drag her down the aisle and through the carriage, and then the next, but then before a compartment between carriages they come to a sudden stop. I stumble over my feet, scrambling into a chair as quietly as possible, watching intently to see what they're going to do. I squint. One of the engineers is rubbing his thumb around the rim of the open door button instead of pressing it. He does this only once in a rough circle, and the button starts to glow a soft red. He presses it, and the door opens except the view beyond the door. It doesn't match the view that was visible through the window. I stare in shock as the engineers step through. I get only a few precious seconds to take in as much as I can. The walls are reddish pink. The floor looks wet. There's movement, and the woman screams, trying to grab hold of the door as she is taken through, but it closes behind her with a hiss, and she's gone. The view through the door window shows only the next carriage. I stare in alarm and disbelief, but I rise to my feet and hasten over. I look through the door window. No sign of the woman or the engineers. I press the button, and the door opens. It's just the next carriage. A few of the seats are occupied by the red passengers. I wait for the door to close by itself, then I look down at the button. All right, screw it. Fortune favors the brave, right? Come on. You got this. I try to replicate what the engineer did. I trace my thumb around the edge in a rough circle, and sure enough the button starts to glow a faint red. I take a deep breath and I press it, and the door opens. I step through. The view beyond the carriage windows is broadly the same, though the beach is much closer now. It's the walls, the actual body of the train itself, that draws my attention now. They are indeed a deep reddish pink, and the floor is soaked, dark, damp, sticky. The light in here is red too. It's like being in one of those dark rooms they use for developing photographs. It's humid. The air feels thick, heavy. I can hear my own breathing. I take a cautious step into the carriage. All of the seats in here are occupied, most with a red passenger, some with a void like shimmering men. A faint glowing white beyond the carriage door window at the far end of the aisle tells me that the engineers are still close by. I stride down the length of the car, holding tight to as much confidence as I can, trying to come up with some kind of a plan on the fly. Should I try to take the engineers by surprise? Use my semiconductor status to try and trick them? I'm all over the options desperately as I walk the aisle. I try not to pay attention to how the walls seem to be quivering, gently contracting in and out, throbbing almost. I follow on into the next carriage. The deep reddish pink walls of the carriage give way, in some places, to long, pale, thin arcs, squished up, and between the walls strange material, structural support beams of some kind perhaps. They look white in color, though it's hard to be sure given the strange lighting. I pass through the next carriage and the next. More and more of the red passengers are replaced with the shimmering men. One of these men, to my horror, appears like less of a man and more like a lobster perhaps. Enormous, alien yet silent. I pass on by, teeth clenched. It becomes clear as they become easier and easier to see that the structural support beams aren't beams at all, not like any I've ever seen. They look like bones arced up toward the ceiling, like great ribs pressed, squeezed tight between the throbbing, leaking walls of the train. It's horrific. It makes me feel sick, and the air grows thicker. The soft white glow through the train doors ahead, the one that I've been following at a steady distance, suddenly becomes brighter, then brighter still, and the forms of engineers start to become visible. Shit, there's a group of them heading toward me. I look around helplessly. There are no free seats in this part of the train. There's nowhere at all for me to sit down. Trying to remain calm, I take a few cautious steps back through the door I just come through, and into the compartments between carriages. I look around for a bathroom to hide in, but there's none, nor is there even a fire extinguisher or anything I can arm myself with. So, with my options limited, I decide to just head to the corner and stand still. Totally still, heart pounding by the wall, looking at the floor as the door bursts open. 4 or 5 engineers run past, elbows out, hunched forward, most paying me no mind, but one of them slows down. It pauses and looks me over. I can see its wide, terrible, and unnatural eyes scanning me in my peripheral vision, but I do not stir, and thankfully, after a terrible moment of uncertainty, the engineer turns and carries on along its way, and after a deep breath, I carry on along mine. I can no longer see the engineers up ahead, but I follow down the aisles and through the dark and damp carriages regardless. The windows grow smaller with each new car. Eventually, the windows are lost altogether. One of the carriages, I find to my dismay, is occupied with no seats or passengers of any kind, but rather with 2 great, throbbing, loudly thumping, steadily shifting mounds of flesh, organ-like. I have to push between them to get through the aisle, and they feel damp and hot against my skin. It is revolting, but I keep pushing forward. I don't know what else to do. I can see more engineers up ahead, though they aren't coming this way. Flashes of glowing white through the door windows, 3 carriages away, then 2, and then 1. This carriage is, like all of the previous carriages I'd walked through, fully occupied, but there's only a handful of red passengers in here now. The majority of the seats are occupied by the dark, shimmering men, and they are large in this carriage. Oversized, bloated, only vaguely human-like, with their strange colors and half-lights wavering across their unnatural, featureless forms. I crouch behind the train door and peek through the window. The scene beyond is a nightmare, the worst I've ever laid eyes upon, on board or otherwise. I slam a hand to my mouth, staring, shaking, scarcely able to comprehend the grisly picture behind the window. This could well be the front of the train, the engine. I cannot see a door on the other side, at least. The carriage beyond it is twice the height of any of the previous. It throbs, blood red. Dark stains and strange liquids ooze down its bulging walls and over the floor. A few meters ahead, I can see 2 humans, immobilized somehow, pressed awkwardly up against the wall, struggling. One of them is the woman I've been following. There are half a dozen engineers in here. One of them is holding something. I gag as I realize it's a human arm, messily severed. I watch as it throws the arm towards the central feature of the carriage, or perhaps engine. The terrible centerpiece in question is an enormous, gaping, wet mouth built into the body of the train, colossal, vibrating nerves and tendons and grotesque, stretched red skin connecting it to the walls, ceiling and floor, lined all the way around its edge with grinding, crunching, scarlet-stained teeth. It moans, a strangled noise like the sound of an old engine, and mashes the arm to pulp in seconds, leaking dark liquid over the floor. I watch in abject horror as 2 of the engineers grab the human to the right of the woman, a young man, and hurled him without a second thought into the mouth. I flinch, squeeze my eyes tightly shut, but I'm too late really. I see enough. The hungrily, desperately biting, chewing, monstrous mouth of the train, mashing the screaming man into red waste. I force down another rise of bile, shaking, my stomach lurching bitterly. Good God, what chance do I have? An incompetent, pathetic wretch of a man like me. How can I possibly hope to save this woman? For God's sake, I mutter to myself, running a hand through my hair, desperately trying to think. I glance behind me, and directly into the wide and staring eyes of an engineer. I stare into the engineer's eyes, and he presses suddenly forwards. The pincers tap tightly into his face, begin to tremble. I scream, staggering backwards into the engine room. Conductor! A breathless cry from my right, from the woman, held tight and drawn away from the wall, her arms locked behind her back by an engineer. I look all around me wildly, slipping on the dark, stained floor. Engineers scramble away from the walls, clicking furiously, cracking. One of them locks itself around my right arm from behind. The great mouth wails hungrily. Act. It's time to act. Now. Act. Now. I relent, ever so slightly, giving in to the engineer, moving backwards with it. Then I push hard, throwing it off, though not completely. I still feel its sharp grip scrape down the side of my arm, tearing my jacket, and I lurch forward, slamming into the engineer in front of me and sending him staggering backwards, half falling into the previous carriage. I take in a deep breath, raising my head up high, and I shout as loud and as clear as I can down into the carriage with the full force of my lungs. Attention, all passengers. I, a legitimate conductor aboard this train, demand proof for the validity of your journeys. Every one of you show me your tickets. Show them now. I feel a heavy pair of pincers tear into my shoulder blade from behind, and I gasp out in shock. No breath left for a scream, and it drags me back into the engine room for a terrible moment. Nothing in the carriage beyond seems to stir. And then there is chaos. The red passengers, few as they are, dutifully lift their arms to reveal their tickets. But the shimmering men, bloated and human, shifting and trembling, they burst, almost as one, into dozens upon dozens of disgusting, crawling, shimmering spider crabs, some large, some small, some more lobster-like than crab-like, but screeching and clamoring around the carriage all the same. Some burst through the door into the engine room, and I feel the pincers detach from my shoulder. I stagger to my knees with a cry of pain as the engineers all scramble around in disarray as the hordes of shimmering creatures surge across the walls, the floors, the ceilings. Some of the engineers push through into the carriage beyond. Some remain to throw themselves around in the engine room after the spiders that have gotten in. The mouth of the train roars and cries, and I stagger to my feet, grabbing a tight hold of the woman beside me and dragging her through the carriage as fast as I can, slamming aside engineers, gritting my teeth against the strange and sickly feeling of the legs of the shimmering spider crabs crawling all over me, brushing against me. I break into a run and she runs with me, and we tear through the carriages, carriage after carriage through the chaos. On we run, leaving the swarming, bloody thrall behind us, but they will follow. I know it. The train begins to slow, and I skid to a breathless halt, slamming into a wall as the woman does the same. We're coming up on your stop, aren't we? I say to her through pants, pain surging across my back, the muscles in my legs aflame. We are. She chokes back through breaths. Yes. Then go. I force open an emergency door, grunting as I do so, the whistle of the wind loud. I look out. We're on land now, white-gray sand below, broken columns and pillars and strange cone-like towers in the distance rush by. Maybe I should wait until we come to a complete stop. She begins. Now approaching, the intercom crackles and spells out the name of a place I could not repeat, many-syllabled like a hiss. It's gone from my mind almost the second I hear it. You'll be fine, I say desperately. They'll be after you. They could be coming right now. Do you want to take that chance? Please just go. Your friends, keep an eye out for them. They might have survived being thrown from the train. She nods anxiously and steps to the edge. The train decelerates, but we're still traveling at significant speed. She looks back at me and smiles. Thank you, conductor. I smile back, exhausted, and she turns and jumps. We're still going too fast for me to see her hit the ground, but it's sand, soft sand. She'll be okay. I pull the door shut with a grunt and look behind me. No sign of the engineers yet, but that doesn't mean they aren't after me. I press on through the carriages, legs aching, until I begin to wonder if my trek is completely necessary. Am I still able to travel between them by the way of pressing the button? I try it. At the next intersection between carriages, I run my thumb around the door button in a circle, repeating the motion I made to enter this section of the train. It glows a soft white this time, and I head through the door. On the other side, I find I'm no longer bathed in a strange red dark room light. The walls do not appear to be made with any kind of flesh or bone, and the windows are as they were, clear and large. I breathe a sigh of relief, though I'm not sure why entirely. The engineers could just as easily follow me through, but I do feel slightly safer somehow. There are plenty of empty seats here, and I slump into one, exhausted, looking out the window as the train chunners to a stop. My shoulder and arm throb in monotonous, painful bursts. The intercom crackles, and the name of the station is announced, but once again, I cannot keep a hold of it in my mind. I sit for a while in silence. With a hiss and a groan, the train continues along its journey. I stay seated for another hour, perhaps. I sob to myself for a while during this time. I try my phone again, to no avail. I try the radio. It gives me only static. I get up. I walk down the train. I have no idea where I am now in relation to the front, if that was indeed the front, or to my original position. So I just walk. I walk, and as luck would have it, I see ahead after a while another conductor. A true conductor, hovering down the aisle in the carriage ahead. I've had plenty of time to think since departing from the chaos of the front carriages, and I believe I've formulated a weak, but not altogether hopeless sort of plan. I'm a conductor myself, after all, and what would I do if I was approached by a passenger without a ticket? It isn't much to go on, but I have little else. I approach the conductor, heart hammering. If this goes wrong, then I'm going to make a break for it. I won't screw around. I'll take my chances with the jump into the realm beyond. I won't allow myself to be taken to the front. I won't. I struggle to think of a fate worse than being chewed up by that leaking, moaning, grinding mouth in the train. Recycled. I press through the door into the carriage, and before I have a chance to psych myself out, I say calmly but clearly, "Excuse me, conductor. I would like to alter my journey if possible. I would just like to get home, please." The conductor hovers before me, writhing slowly. The low, droning buzz of the thing sets my teeth on edge, but I hold my ground. It is silent for a moment. Then, "Your journey cannot be altered, passenger. Your journey has been marked." My heart hammers. I want to leave. I want to remove myself from the situation before it those dreaded words, before it asks for my ticket. But I need more. I need some hope. So I ask again, could I purchase a second ticket? I would like to amend my journey, conductor. But I'm given the same response. Your journey cannot be altered, passenger. Your journey has been marked. Marked. My journey has been marked. The conductor starts to drift towards me, and I step back and out of its way. It hovers on through the aisle and into the next carriage. I watch it ask a red passenger for her ticket. She raises an arm, and the conductor stamps it. It marks it. It marks the ticket. The R, that same symbol, marked into the passenger's ticket. The passenger's skin. I look down at the symbol on the back of my own hand, the hastily carved R, the one that the junkie gave me. And an idea forms. It's not the best idea. It makes me feel sick, in fact, but it's my only idea. I watch as the conductor shimmers and disappears from view, and I set out down along the carriages with a renewed but bitter sense of grim purpose. I walk for hours, hours upon hours upon hours. I sit a few times to avoid groups of engineers. I pass a human couple who refuse to talk with me. I pass the red passengers, silent and staring. I pass shimmering men and shimmering monsters. Hour after hour, I march through the train, my eyes weary. I'm desperate for some rest, for some sleep. But not yet. Not just yet. Keep on walking. My steps become jarring. My muscles are seizing up. But I walk on. The view outside has long since changed. Up the trail climbed, up into the night sky, high, high above the ground. And colossal, twisting, whirling towers of wind and glass roar and spin in the distance through the air. Clouds rush by, dark and furious. I come at last to something I recognize. The broken, roofless carriage. Jagged, torn walls. Missing chairs. Passengerless. The wind is ungodly now, and I stagger on down the aisle, my eyes watering, gripping at the remaining chairs, using them to pull myself forwards, deafened by the scream of the howling winds and the towering cyclones beyond. I don't want to get too close to the edge, but I try to peer over, to see if I can see the ground. I cannot. I push on. I head through a carriage splattered with dark and shimmering stains, with edges of the chairs torn, a piece of railing slightly bent, evidence of a scuffle. I pass through a compartment with an out-of-place fire extinguisher. The glint of the light reflecting off it catches my eye. It's exactly where I left it, against the wall by the mashed spider crab carcass. On I go through the carriages. I pass through the one in which I saw the teenage boy, though he is gone now, until I am certain beyond all doubt that I am back to where I started. The dried bloodstains across the floor and up the seats is proof enough. This is where the junkie carved this infernal symbol into my hand. Except on reflection, he probably wasn't a junkie at all. He was probably just as terrified and almost as uncertain about his surroundings as I was. He was still an asshole, though. I get down onto my hands and knees and search across the floor of the carriage. When the engineers threw the non-junkie off the train, one of them had had his knife wedged precariously in the side of its head. But when they approached the table where I sat in terrified silence with the woman, the knife had vanished. Which means they either took it for themselves or it's somewhere still on the train. I search each chair with real, dedicated focus. I push aside the feet of the red passengers and in the shadows I find it. The blade. I squeeze my fist in triumph, reaching below the seat and drawing it out into the light. The junkie's knife. And my heart starts to pound as I realize that my plan, what had up until now just been a theoretical plan, now had to be put into brutal motion. I sit in the aisle, my back against a rail, and I turn the bloodied knife slowly over in my hands. I look at the symbol on the back of my hand. The R. The mark of my journey. I have no hope of getting a ticket home, while this mark is emblazoned across the back of my hand. That's what I understood from the conductor. I admit, my original plan was to try and sever the entire hand. But as I walked, I began to doubt the necessity of such a brutal measure. I came up with an alternative. I tear off a strip of my sleeve and create a makeshift gag for myself. Something to bite down on, to stifle my groans of distress and shakily. Desperately, I begin to slice the blade into the skin on the back of my hand. I release a grunt. The edges of my vision flash. This is going to be really difficult. I move myself into a chair by the window, opposite an unsympathetic red passenger. "What are you staring at?" I mutter to it as fresh blood leaks over my arm. I look down and drive the blade in deeper, then deeper still. It has to be in deep enough to remove all trace of the R, the carved symbol, the mark. So I slice. I push the knife through the back of my hand, hacking away at pieces of flesh. In some parts, my trembling arm betrays me, and I cut too deep. Dark blood gushes onto the little table in front of me, and over my shirt and jacket, and I start to feel lightheaded. But there is no alternative. That's what I keep telling myself. There is no alternative. Get it done. So I do, sawing away, sweating, whimpering. I slice off the necessary flesh. The back of my hand becomes a wreck, throbbing, leaking, hanging bits of messily cut skin. But eventually, all trace of the symbol is gone. I tear off a larger piece of my sleeve, wrap it tight around the hand, unable to help myself, releasing a bitter cry as I do so. I wipe sweat from my eyes, taking some deep, shuddering breaths, calming myself as best I can. And I wait. I wait for a long, long time. It's 3 weeks before I see a conductor again. I went around asking red passenger after red passenger if I could see their tickets. And when I found one without a stamp, I sat by it and waited. I hear that familiar droning buzz. I stand. I see it shimmer down the aisle towards me. And I approach. "Conductor," I say soft. The moment of truth having finally arrived. "I would like to purchase a ticket home, please." For a minute, the conductor says nothing. Then it speaks, and its mouthless voice vibrates around my head. "To which station are you headed?" My stomach lurches. "To St. Joseph's Stand, England," I say clearly. Then, "The station on the route that begins in London and ends in Edinburgh." I add, just in case. Another moment's pause. "The price for this ticket will be 1 year and 1 month. Will you purchase?" "A year and a month." What does that mean? A year and a month off my life? A year and a month on the train? But these questions are trivial, really. I've been offered a way home. And I'm taking it. By God, I'm taking it. I will purchase. I whisper. The conductor bids me to raise a hand. And I choose my good hand. The conductor touches it with a writhing, pale arm. And it starts to itch. It starts to sting. Like a wasp sting. But slow, not sharp. A ticket, one of those of the red passengers, begins to form between my fingers. Webbed, stretched skin forms, with text and typeface visible across it. I grimace as it comes into being. "Please take your seat, passenger," the conductor says. And then he's off, hovering away down the aisle and into the next carriage without another word. I look at the ticket between my fingers, and sure enough, a seat is written there, below the cryptic lines and half circles, the same I'd seen on the fire extinguisher. LKP90. So I head in the opposite direction to the conductor. I head towards my seat. It takes me a few hours, and when I find it, I sit. I sit, and I watch the strange realms roll by through the window. I sit for a long time. A long, long time. With nothing but my thoughts, mostly of how bad a father and a husband and a man I've been in my life back home, and the view beyond the glass. I remain on the train for 10 months, coming up towards the 11th month now. A lot happened to me during that time. Stories for another day, perhaps. I met a young girl, though. I shared with her the secret of the ticket in my hand. She asked if it would work for someone who wasn't employed by the rail industry back home, and I told her I didn't know. I did cut her symbol off for her, however, at her request. We decided to flee the carriage after she started to cry, but luckily the engineers didn't come for us. Once she'd calmed down, she thanked me and she left, off on the hunt for a conductor. I never saw her again. I'll tell you just one more thing I did see, though. Something you may find of interest. I saw the red passengers move. All of them. At once. It scared the absolute hell out of me when they all shot up, rising to a stand with no prior warning at all. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I remember how I gripped the rail of my seat, my knuckles white, watching in disbelief as they turned as one and marched robotically down the aisle, veins bulging as they stood to wait by the doors. How they waited so patiently for the train to come to a stop. Plexus, the voice over the intercom cracked simply, now arriving. And the train rolled out of a long dark tunnel and into a world of swirling scarlet mist and taut, stretched webbing of crimson and wine pulled tight between the landscape's strange segmented towers of off-white and the dark mountains beyond. Alien lights flickered and sped the length of this webbing, thousands upon thousands of them, all shooting in different directions and all beneath a deep and unsettling red sky. The passengers all left the train in an orderly fashion in a dead and eerie silence, yet somehow positively pulsating with anticipatory electricity. Some of the shimmering men, I did not fail to notice, departed with them. The train remained at this particular stop for longer than the others, much longer, granting enough time for the passengers' replacements to board in their stead. Silent, red-eyed and blank-faced, settling programmatically into their seats before the doors drew to a welcome close and the train continued on along its way. I thought about that day for a long, long time. I was never able to make much sense of it, however. I had grown to believe, over the course of my journey, that my ticket's 1 year and 1 month payment related to the time it would take to get home. But this theory dissipated when my station was announced one night over the intercom, just under a week before the beginning of the 11th month. I sat up straight at once, adrenaline surging. Did I hear it correctly? Yes. Yes, I did. I'm sure of it. I definitely did. Now approaching St. Joseph's Stand, England. That's England. St. Joseph's Stand. The intercom says, before crackling into silence. I rise to my feet, giddy, my legs trembling. I'd been sleeping, but I'm wide awake now, and I stare out the window. I see the hills. God, I see the moors, the fields, the wild grass fields. I recognize this route. It's mine. It's my route. I could jump for joy. I could explode, but I don't. I hold steady. I remain quiet, and I go to stand by the door, shaking with anticipation. The train slows, and I hear the gentle drum of rain upon the carriage roof. The train shunners to a complete stop, and with a trembling finger, I press the button for the door to the outside, the end of the line, and I step out onto the platform, hit at once by cool country night air, and I look up into the rain. I dance then. I dance in a spontaneous circle, grinning, whooping, hollering, laughing louder than I've ever laughed before. I crouch down, touch the wet ground, concrete. I haven't felt concrete in such a long time. I look at my hand, the ticket hand. I watch as the web ticket dissolves into dead, flaky skin. Watch it drift off in the damp breeze. I look up and make eye contact with the station's lone occupant, a man in a hoodie and a leather jacket, smoking, leaning against one of the narrow pillars that support the little station's low roof. "You are right there, pal," he asks after a moment. I stand and jump a few steps closer to him. "Can I borrow your phone, please, sir?" I asked, my voice wavering with delight. I'm home. I'm home. I'm home. I'm home. This miserable little shithole never looks so beautiful. The man looks me over in silence and breathes out a puff of smoke. He takes in my scarred, wrecked hands, my torn, bloodstained jacket, my eyes wide and wild. Yeah, no, I don't think so. Sorry, mate." He reaches into his pocket and pulls out a coin, flicking it onto the floor by my feet. "Go buy yourself a hot drink." He chuckles and turns for another drag. The train behind me begins to chunner away slowly off to its next station. Still grinning, I march right up to the man, closing the distance between us in a quick second, and grab him by the collar, slamming him hard up against a little pillar as his cigarette tumbles to the wet ground. I lean in close. It wasn't really a request made. I mutter through clenched teeth. The man, speechless and panic, reaches into his jacket pocket and hands me his phone with trembling fingers. And I take, releasing him and moving a few steps back. "I'm not a thief," I assure him. "I'll return it. Just give me a second." He nods. I walk a little farther and punch in my daughter's number, calling it. I press the phone up against my ear. It rings. "Dad," she says. She sounds tired. Why are you calling me so late? Is everything okay? Are you still at work?" "Yes." I begin. "Oh God, because I love you. Everything's fine." I beam, and I wonder if she can feel the radiance of my smile through the phone. And no, as it happens, I'm not still at work. I unbuckle the radio from my belt, and I fling it down onto the tracks where it breaks. I actually just quit. I don't know why, but America seems cursed to have ghosts all over the place. Maybe it has something to do with the fact it's built on a few hundred ancient burial grounds. But hey, that's not my issue. If you were to roll your wagon down to San Antonio, Texas, and take a trip to Shane Road, you'll find a set of railroad tracks that have become quite the local legend. Many years ago, around the 1940s, a school bus full of kids were on their way home from school and was passing over a level crossing when the bus broke down. As the driver struggled to start the bus, a train came barreling down the line. The driver tried to get as many kids off the bus as they could, but it was too late as the train slammed into it, killing roughly 10 children and the driver. Another account of the story says that it was a nun driving the bus late in the evening. Most of the kids were asleep, and the nun was trying to quietly restart the bus when the train appeared out of nowhere. The locomotive's headlamp had broken, so it wasn't visible until it was bearing down on the bus. The nun tried to wake the kids in time but failed, resulting in 10 children dying. Miraculously, she was thrown out of the front window of the bus on impact and survived the event. Distraught at the thought of causing the deaths of several children, the nun became guilt-ridden and drove to the crossing a few days later, stopping her car in the middle of the tracks, waiting for the next train. Later, when a train did appear, she heard faint familiar voices. Then, her car was slowly pushed forwards off the crossing, just before the train would have struck it. She quickly got out of the car and looked around for the person that had saved her life, only to find nobody around and several child-sized handprints on the back of her car. Blessed with newfound purpose, the nun opened an orphanage to look after lost children in the same way the lost children looked after her. To this day, the ghosts are supposedly still there. As if you were to stop your car on the crossing, it is said that the spirits will push your car to safety. Many have tried it and found their cars did move. Others have sprinkled baby powder on their car as they've stopped and reported seeing handprints be left behind after their car was moved. The ghosts have appeared in other ways too. Some say that if you stand by the crossing late at night, you can hear the sound of a steam locomotive approaching. It sounds its whistle, and you can hear its brakes scream as if it's trying to stop, but no train is ever seen. Another story involved a local woman driving past the crossing one night and spotting a little girl standing beside the line, all alone. The woman stopped and offered the girl a ride home. She got in the car, and when they arrived at the girl's house, she seemed hesitant to get out. The woman assumed the girl had fallen out with her parents and ran away from home, so she stepped out of the car saying she'd talk with her parents. As she stepped out of the car, she looked back to give the girl a reassuring smile, only for the girl to have vanished. She opened the car door to find nobody there, with no sign of her around. The seatbelt, however, was still fastened. Another account of the ghosts came a few years ago, when a girl and several of her friends traveled to the site. After taking a few pictures, she emailed them to her mother, only for her to be shocked when she spotted a ghost in one of her daughter's pictures. It is possible, however, that the whole thing has been made up, as despite people hearing children's voices at the scene as well as seeing their handprints, I found conflicting reports that such an accident ever took place in San Antonio. A bus was hit by a train in 1938 during a blizzard, but that was in Salt Lake City in Utah. It's quite possible that some wires were crossed at some point and the stories got mixed up, but all the same, the ghosts are still present in San Antonio, so maybe something did happen at that crossing. I just suppose we'll never know what it was that caused those children to stick around. Ghosts take on many forms, be they animals, people, or ominous figures that stand at the end of your garden, watching you while your back is turned, and what was that thing you just saw out the corner of your eye? But surprisingly, one frequently cited ghost takes on a rather different form, the form of a former U.S. president. Of all the presidents that have died, Abraham Lincoln seems to be the one that doesn't want to shuffle off of his mortal coil anytime soon, as there have been many accounts of his ghost being spotted all around the White House and other areas he frequently worked in. With President Truman hearing raps at the door while sleeping in the Lincoln bedroom, Eleanor Roosevelt and the family dog sensing Lincoln's presence throughout the White House, and even sightings of his ghost at his grave in Springfield, Illinois, it's fair to say he doesn't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon. And it's not just Americans that have met the spirit. During a visit to the White House, Prime Minister Winston Churchill was taking a long late-night bath with a drink of scotch and a cigar to help him relax. The account says he got out of the bath and entered the adjoining bedroom still naked apart from the cigar, and was startled to see Lincoln standing by the fireplace leaning on the mantel. Churchill supposedly took the cigar out of his mouth, tapped off the ash at the end, and said, "Good evening, Mr. President. You seem to have me at a disadvantage." The ghost chuckled at the remark and disappeared, leaving Churchill naked and a little bamboozled. But Lincoln also seems to have a way of getting his ghostly self around the place when he's looking for a place to spook. In 1865, the U.S. Railroad started work on building a luxury steam locomotive to tow the president around. While Lincoln wasn't a fan of the idea, he still let it be built. He never got to see the finished locomotive, however, on account of him suffering from a terminal case of being shot through the head. It was completed shortly after his death and named the Lincoln Memorial, where it was used to pull Lincoln's funeral train around the country to 12 funerals, all held for the president. The locomotive was never used again after this. Every year in April, around the anniversary of his death, it is said that a ghost train passes through several stations pulling the funeral train. Eyewitnesses say they can hear an odd-sounding steam engine whistle followed by a steam locomotive approaching them, pulling several carriages draped in black, with a strange blue glow surrounding the whole train. It sounds its whistle again as it stops at the station. Some accounts say there are skeletons of soldiers on board playing music, though no sound is heard. Others say they've seen the soldiers guard the carriages. After 20 minutes, the engine whistles again and begins to leave the station, eventually disappearing down the line. Locals living in areas where the train stops have reported their clocks stopping for 20 minutes on night where the train is spotted. So who knows? Maybe old Abe is still around and kicking, just not in a physical form. Or it could just be a whole bunch of coincidences. Whatever the case, it'd sure be one hell of a sight to see that pull into the station on your way home from work. Stockholm, Sweden. Home to many things, including the world's narrowest street, a bunch of museums, and the world's largest hemispherical building. It's also home to a very infamous ghost train, or more accurately, ghost subway. In 1965, the Stockholm Metro purchased 8 unpainted second-hand subway carriages to add to their fleet of locomotives. They were left with just bare aluminium while they were being tested instead of being painted green like the rest of the fleet. If they were cheap to run, build, and maintain, then they would help expand the Metro transit system. At the time, all the carriages on the Metro were painted green, so the sudden appearance of unpainted silver carriages came as a surprise to the regular commuters. The trains were nicknamed Silver Pillin, or the Silver Arrow in English, by the locals, but weren't well liked by passengers because of their bare look. On top of that, because they were being tested, no posters or advertisements were put up, giving them an eerie atmosphere while riding inside them. It also didn't help that they were secondhand, so while they were kept clean, they were still clearly worn out and dirty in some places. The dystopian appearance of the carriages compared to the more uniform green carriages used by the Metro led them to become the center of some urban myths. Some began to say that if you got on board the Silver Arrow, you wouldn't be taken to any station. Instead, you'd just travel and never get out. Other stories said that, once a year after midnight, the train appears, filled with passengers of the living dead, all bearing expressionless vacant looks. If you wanted to get to the next station and boarded Silver Pillin, it would be 1 week before you arrived. In 1975, the Metro expanded and built a station at Shumlenge to service an area that was expected to develop. The area was never developed, and as such, the station was never fully completed, and subsequently never opened for passenger use. Because it was never used by passengers, it was left bare, giving it a very empty and haunting appearance. Rumors soon spread that the station was only used by spirits, and that only the dead get off at Shumlenge. It wasn't long before the station and Silver Pillin story became intertwined, and it soon became the home of the ghost train. The stories were obviously never real, but they stuck to the trains and the station regardless. The Silver Arrow carriages were eventually decommissioned in 1996, and all but 2 were scrapped. One was put into a local railway museum, while the other is located at the factory that built it. Despite the carriages being gone, the story still remains, showing that just because something is gone doesn't mean it's forgotten. In recent years, older buildings have been repurposed as times and industries change. Many grand railway stations have converted old halls and hotel rooms into office spaces or storage for maintenance equipment. There's a railway station in Vancouver, however, that along with these changes, also seems to have converted itself into a haunted house. Waterfront Station was built by the Canadian Pacific Railway in 1915 and served as a terminus for passenger trains traveling from Toronto and Montreal. The station was built in a time when traveling by train had of elegance and class, and as such, The station was built with restaurants and a dance hall occupying the west wing of the building, and places of residence and lodging for travelers in the east wing. In 1928, a brakeman named Hub Clark was working in the yard when he slipped on a wet rail and was knocked unconscious, laying across the tracks. A passenger train came down the line a few minutes later and killed him, supposedly decapitating him. Ever since, a headless man wandering around the area holding a lantern has supposedly been spotted on rainy nights. The thing is, Clark doesn't seem to be the only ghost lingering around the station. As times have changed, the restaurant is now located in the east wing, with the upper floors either being used for office spaces or storage. Security guards usually patrol around the area at night, and many have claimed to have encountered some rather unusual things. One guard reported they heard the sound of 1920s music playing in a corridor. When they investigated, they found a woman dancing alone in a 1920s style flapper dress. As the guard approached her, the music suddenly stopped and the woman vanished. Another guard said while they were patrolling the northwest corridor of the building, they entered an empty room with only a flashlight to look around, only to encounter the ghost of an old woman. The woman supposedly glowed white and had a mournful look on her face. The woman reached out toward the guard, to which the guard turned and ran. On the upper floor of the east side, a guard said they entered a room that was used to store a number of old desks. As they looked around, a desk was quietly moved in front of the door. When the guard turned and saw the desk blocking the doorway, they quickly jumped over it and ran out of the room. There have also been several reports of hearing phantom footsteps around the station, and many said to have seen the ghosts of 3 little old ladies sat on a station bench as if waiting for a train. The most ominous story came when a security guard was checking an old kitchen, only to find an old woman standing there, staring intently at him. She began to float towards the guard, who immediately turned and ran. For days afterward, he kept seeing the face of the old woman appear in his dreams, and seeing her reflection in windows and mirrors. He eventually was overcome with the urge to paint the woman, despite having little prior art experience. Once done, he left the painting in the kitchen, and he didn't see the old woman again. After a while, management had someone move the painting out of the kitchen. The person that moved the painting said they began having dreams of the old woman, and that they didn't stop until they put the painting back. The ghost of Hub Clark is well within its rights to haunt the station, but it seems it's not alone. However, this old lady is haunting the station too, seems to have it in for someone. Hopefully someone will eventually find a way to calm the spirit down, as I'm sure many of the security guards would be thankful for it. Lake Superior is a beautiful place, but don't let that fool you. The lake may look tame, but many ships have sank or been lost to its unforgiving tides. Because of this, the lake is home to many a tale of ghost ships and lost souls. What you might not expect, though, among all the ghost ships and lost sailors, are the spirits of a few railroad men also haunting the waters. In June of 1910, a freight train was rolling along the line of the Canadian Pacific Railway, following the shores of Lake Superior. The driver was a man named Frank Wheatley. Accompanying him was fireman E. Clark and brakeman J. McMillan. It was late at night, and they were getting close to Mink Harbor. By morning, however, the train hadn't arrived at its destination. No breakdown was reported, and the train was never seen arriving at Mink Harbor. The train hadn't simply vanished, though. After investigating the line, it was found that a rock slide had occurred. The line followed a cliff face, with a wall of rock on one side of the track and a 65-foot drop into the lake below on the other. The train had rounded a blind corner and ran right into the rock slide, with the engine and several wagons running off the rails into the lake below. The brakeman was found dead beside the tracks. Evidence suggested he panicked and tried to jump to safety, but died after leaping from the train. The driver and fireman went down into the lake along with the engine, with only the driver's body ever found. The location of the wreck was charted, but nobody was able to dive down to it or recover the engine, as the diving equipment required for such a job simply wasn't available. For many years after, people said they've spotted 3 silhouettes standing beside the line where the train derailed, seeming to appear and disappear at will. While nobody has managed to get a good enough look at them to confirm if they are the spirits of the engine men, given how the accident happened in that location, it's more than likely the 3 men are still there, looking for their lost train. In 2014, the wreck was eventually explored by divers who photographed the rusted remains. Plans to haul the engine out of the lake were made, but quickly scrapped when it was made clear the metal was far too rusted and frail to be moved without breaking apart. The divers also tried searching for the body of the fireman, but it was never found. The railway ghosts of Lake Superior are by far the least well known, as they are overshadowed by many of the other stories of ghost ships and spooky sailors sailing around the lake. But it's still nice to see a little diversity in the ghost population from time to time. You wouldn't expect anything of note to happen on a quiet branch line in Ireland, but if there's one thing ghosts love, it's appearing in places you wouldn't expect. 'Twas the summer of 1924 in Ireland. Along a quiet branch line between Clones and Armour, there was a small station platform. Two men were sat at the empty station waiting for the next train. As they waited, they started to hear several hushed voices coming from the station building behind them. Among the voices was a series of moans and groans. One of them was curious and peeked through the station window, but only saw an empty room with several benches and a long table inside. He returned to his colleague and sat down, likely brushing off the noises as nothing. Very soon, they heard the sound of an engine's whistle and stood up, moving to the edge of the platform in anticipation of its arrival. The sound of the approaching train became louder and louder, but no train was seen. The sound then passed them and continued down the line, as if the train wasn't visible. As it passed, they heard a loud scream followed by an almost deafening engine whistle. The signal man came down to the station 2 minutes later, and the men questioned him on whether or not he heard or saw anything. The signal man said he heard nothing. After further conversation, the signal man informed the two men that a man had jumped in front of a train from the same platform a year prior, uncertain if it was an accident or an attempt of suicide. He was seriously injured but alive, so he was brought into the station's waiting room in an attempt to save him. Unfortunately, his injuries were severe, and he passed away soon after. The signal man pointed out the table the man had spotted in the waiting room, and said, "He died right there on that table." The line has been closed in recent years, and all that remains is the grown-over track bed and a few stations. Many people have contested the story or brushed it off as a myth, but a man still died, and for all we know, his ghost might still be there, along with the train that took his life. If you travel on any metro system in the world, you're bound to see some weird people. I don't know what it is about subways, but for whatever reason, they just seem to cause weird people to spawn out of thin air. If you were to travel on the London Underground, though, you might find that one or two of these weird people literally do appear out of thin air. Born in 1847, William Tyrrese was a very famous and beloved English actor who became well known for playing famous heroic roles such as Robin Hood and starred in many reenactments of Shakespeare's plays. He was known to be an interesting character with a handsome face, fine voice, and a very friendly demeanor. This charisma allowed him to star in many theatrical performances, with comedy being one of his strong suits. Around the late 1890s, Tyrrese helped a young actor by the name of Richard Prince find work in plays and performances he was starring in. Over the years, however, Prince had started to abuse alcohol, and by 1897 it had become a massive problem. By the December of 1897, Prince was unable to find work, and so Tyrrese gave Prince some money to help keep him going until he got a break. On the 13th of December, they had a falling out, and 3 days later, on the 16th, Prince was denied money from the fund's office. Later that night, as Tyrrese was entering the Adelphi Theater, Prince jumped him and stabbed him to death. Tyrese's last words were supposedly, "I will come back." When Prince was caught, he was arrested and thrown into the Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum. The London Underground is a rather scary place to be at night. Maybe it's the empty atmosphere, maybe it's the unnerving sound of trains and squeaking and echoing down the tunnels, or maybe it's just because it's London and you're likely going to get stabbed yourself. In any case, the Underground is a spooky place, which was only made spookier when people started to spot a ghost wandering around Covent Garden Station. Many drivers have spoken of seeing a shadowy figure in one of the tunnels after the station has been cleared for the night, alongside echoing footsteps, a disembodied voice, and many unexplained banging noises. A ticket collector at the station said he had many encounters with the specter. One night while checking over the empty platform, the ticket collector spotted a tall, distinguished man walking along the rails in a westbound direction before climbing the emergency spiral stairs. The ticket collector phoned the clerk upstairs and informed them of the approaching man. The ticket collector took the lift up to the clerk, only to be met by the confused clerk when he arrived, who informed him that nobody had come up the stairs. A few days later, the same ticket collector was having his midnight dinner in the staff room when he heard the door open. Assuming it was just another member of staff on break, He continued his meal until he turned and saw he was face to face with the same tall, distinguished man as before. He was wearing a gray suit with a high-collar shirt and white gloves. The ticket collector asked what the man wanted, thinking he was a passenger that had gotten lost, only for the man to say nothing, simply staring at the collector before fading away. For days later, while in the staff room, several station employees were disturbed by a loud scream, followed by a young porter rushing into the room, wide-eyed and frightened. He claimed to have seen a strange-looking man stood in the corner of the neighboring room, but as he approached the man, he felt a disturbing sensation and an oppressive weight beat down onto him, before the man simply faded away. Another station foreman encountered the ghost, feeling the same sense of dread. This time he heard a disembodied voice murmuring a name that sounded something close to Terry. After being shown a picture of the dead actor, the foreman confirmed that the ghost he had seen was that of William Therese. The ghost of Therese has been spotted all over London, from strolling down the street to haunting the very theater he died in. It's unknown why exactly Therese has decided to spook the London Underground of all places, but the current theory is that Covent Garden Station was built in the same place as a bakery that Therese frequently visited. He was known to spend several hours there whenever he visited, so who knows? I suppose it's fitting that he's still just as much of an interesting character in death as he was in life. It seems fairly obvious that you shouldn't walk along railway tracks, but sometimes when you're standing on top of a bridge, staring out at a beautiful view, it can be easy to forget about the few hundred tons of freight that's headed towards you. It's a mistake a few people have made, and ultimately, one that has led to a few places becoming haunted. Built in 1911 for the Wisconsin Central Railway, the Soo Highline Bridge spans across the St. Croix River. There was another bridge spanning the river at the time, but was elevated slightly compared to the rest of the line, necessitating an extra engine to help push heavy trains onto the bridge. The new bridge was more level with the rest of the railway, and so removed the need for extra engines to help push the trains. The bridge is very long and very narrow. Because of this, it is almost impossible to be stood on it while a train is passing over it, as it's only just wide enough to fit an engine and the train it's pulling. As you'd expect, this didn't stop local residents from walking across it, as it was one of the quickest ways across the river at the time. Surprisingly, not too many people have died on the bridge, but there are those who have come to an unfortunate end while trying to cross it. The bridge is roughly half a mile long, so there have been times when people were halfway across when a locomotive came barreling down the line. And because there wasn't enough room for them to stand beside the line, they had to make a choice. Either lay down and hope the engine passes over you, or jump off the side and hope the river gives you a soft landing. Option A wasn't much good, as most American locomotives were fitted with cow catchers, which were designed for moving obstructions off the track, so you'd get hit anyway. Option B, jumping off the side, seemed better on paper because there was a river to break your fall. But it's a very wide river, so you would likely drown, provided you survived the 184-foot drop to begin with. Suffice to say, it'd be much safer for you to just find another path to walk down. Because so many people have met an unfortunate end on the bridge, a walkway and railing has been added in recent years to allow for people to cross the bridge without incident. Everyone who has ever died on the bridge has been found and buried, everyone apart from one man. It's unsure when exactly it happened, but the story goes that a young man was walking across the bridge one day when he was faced with a train bearing down on him. He jumped for his life and died in the river, but his body was never found. Supposedly, his girlfriend, distraught, kept searching for his body long after the incident, but she never managed to find it. After her death, many people say they've seen the ghost of a woman in white searching up and down the bridge. Sometimes it's said that she carries a blue lantern, while others have said they've only ever seen the lantern without the ghost. Those that have encountered her and tried to communicate said that she was unresponsive and simply kept moving down the line, eventually fading away into the distance. While not the most active or infamous ghost to haunt a railway structure, she's still well known in the ghost hunting community. Perhaps it's worth taking a trip over there and giving her a hand, because it certainly sounds like she needs the help. Australia is home to many things: Vegemite, cheap lager, and a vast array of animals that are bred with the sole purpose of ruining your day. If you were to focus on Macquarie Fields, however, you'd also find there are a few ghosts spooking down under. The Macquarie Field station was opened in 1888 and has remained open ever since. In 1906, a woman named Emily Jengerson was killed at the station after being run over by a train. The woman had been suffering from sleeplessness and melancholia to the point where she'd been moved to a mental hospital. On the day of the accident, she was boarding a train to visit her accompanied by a nurse. As they got off at a station, Jen Gerson quickly jumped back onto the train, leaving the nurse behind. After arriving at Macquarie Fields, she stepped off the train and wandered around the station. She was last seen leaving a tool shed before walking into the path of an oncoming train and kneeling on the tracks. Emily was reported as cut to pieces, and the coroner ruled that it was without question a suicide attempt. For years since, a ghost is said to haunt the platform. Strangely though, the ghost appears in the form of a teenage girl. When the station is empty late at night, people say they can hear a faint crying. Others have reported seeing the ghost wandering around the station, and even sitting in the middle of the rails. There's been some speculation as to whether the ghost is even that of Emily Jen Gerson, as other stories say it's the ghost of a regretful suicide victim, or that she fell in front of a train years ago. Others have speculated the ghost is that of a young woman who was murdered after missing the last train home one night. We might not know who the spirit is that's stuck haunting the station, but whoever it is must have a reason for hanging around there. A mystery it shall remain until somebody figures it out, and maybe then people will be a bit less scared on their way home from work. Ghosts appearing in the middle of the woods isn't an uncommon thing. That's why it's always best to travel with a friend whenever you go for a hike. But while traveling through the woods on a hiking trail, miles away from any road or railway, the last thing you'd expect to find is the rusted remains of a steam locomotive and many spirits lurking around it. It was around the 24th of February, 1910 in Wellington, Washington. A mail train and a passenger train both set off for Seattle and had to pass through the mountainside town of Wellington. The town was built to serve as a stop for the Great Northern Railway, where trains could refuel and passengers could stop on long trips. It had been snowing heavily for several days now, with roughly 1 foot of snow falling every hour. On its worst day, 11 feet of snow fell. The mail and passenger trains arrived through a tunnel at the Wellington station. The line was starting to become blocked with snow, and there was nothing the snowplows or the snow shovelers could do to clear it. The snow lasted for days. Workmen were starting to run out of coal to power their plows, and most of the shovelers eventually gave up, saying it was futile and that they weren't being paid enough to deal with it. Passengers of the train could only wait for the weather to clear up. Many became agitated and others became concerned. They asked the workmen if they could back the trains into the nearby tunnels for safety, but the workmen simply said that everything was safe where it was. Passengers and local residents were worried as several avalanches could be heard in the distance over the few days the trains were stuck in Wellington. Most of these avalanches were what was blocking the line. On the 28th of February, the snow had stopped falling, but in its place came rain and warmer winds. At 1 a.m. on the 1st of March, a lightning bolt struck the side of the mountain, causing a slab of snow 1/4 of a mile wide, 1/2 a mile long, and 10 foot tall to break free and come crashing down the mountainside. To make things worse, a forest fire had broken out in the previous summer and destroyed a large amount of the trees between the town and the incoming avalanche. The avalanche missed the town's hotel and post office, but decimated the railroad depot, slamming into the trains and forcing them 150 feet down the mountain and into the Tai River in the valley below. 6 locomotives and 15 wagons, including carriages, were swept away along with the crew and passengers that were sleeping inside them. Out of the 119 people caught in the avalanche, only 23 survived. Among the dead were 35 passengers, 58 railroad employees on the train, and 3 employees based at the depot. The 23 that survived were pulled immediately from the wreck, but the weather conditions made it almost impossible to find all the bodies. It wasn't until 21 weeks later in late July that the last body was recovered. The avalanche is recorded as one of the most fatal in American history. It's said that to this day, people are still finding the remains of the locomotives and carriages that were swept away. Shortly afterwards, the town renamed itself Tai to get away from the associations that came with the accident, and the railway company installed snowsheds to keep the tracks safe along the route. The railway station and depot were eventually closed in 1929 after a second tunnel was built further down the mountain. The town no longer served a purpose and ended up abandoned, eventually being burnt down. The old track bed and tunnel have since been preserved and have become part of the Iron Goat Trail. For years after the accident, people have said they've spotted ghostly figures hanging around the area. Disembodied voices can be heard calling out, wailing, and moaning. Screams and other ominous sounds can be heard in the tunnel sourceless. Many hikers and tourists have found cold spots or areas of the trail that are abnormally cold in comparison to the surrounding area. Some reported feeling sudden chills and goosebumps for no apparent reason, while others claim to have seen apparitions all over the area and felt invisible hands touching and grabbing them. It wouldn't be wrong to assume that the spirits of those who have died in the avalanche may not have gotten over the ordeal. While there isn't much recorded evidence to prove there is something hanging around the trail, the fact that numerous people have reported eerie sights and unsettling feelings while being there is no coincidence. So while the Iron Goat Trail does seem like a nice scenic hiking spot, I'd certainly recommend not being there after dark. Today's ghost story isn't a well-known urban legend like many of the others, but from an article I found online written by someone interested in a local myth. They traveled to Newfoundland to interview a few people with first-hand experience sighting a ghost. This is the story they told. Around the late 1980s, a young lad around the age of 16 was walking home along an old railway track around Manuel's, Conception Bay South in Canada. It was an autumn evening, and he was walking alone when he noticed what sounded like footsteps following behind him. At first, he suspected it was just the stones of the old track bed settling behind him as he walked. But as he continued, he noticed that the sound seemed to be some distance behind him. He stopped and looked back. There was nobody around, but the stones about 15 feet behind him were being disturbed as if someone was walking towards him. He ran away from the noise, and by the time he had reached the end of the tracks, the sound had stopped. A lady also gave another account of the story, with her experience with the ghost taking place roughly in 2004 or 2005. She was out late one night with friends, and as they passed by the tracks, she said she spotted a whitish-gray blob, almost akin to a patch of fog, hovering in the middle of the tracks. As she focused on it, she could clearly see it was a woman dressed in an old-style white dress with her head hung low, as if saddened or searching for something. The woman walked from the tracks to a pathway beside the line that led to the road simply before disappearing. The witness wasn't scared, but was convinced of what she saw. After doing a little digging, it was found the ghost was possibly the phantom of a young bride-to-be named Miss Malloy, who was left standing at the altar. She left the church and started walking down the railway line around Eason's Road. When she heard a train coming, she tried to step off the tracks, but her dress got caught on one of the railway ties. Unable to free herself in time, she was struck down by the train. In typical ghost story fashion, it said her spirit now wanders up and down the line, searching for the man that was meant to be her husband. The story of a bride dying after being left at the altar isn't anything new. In fact, it's a very frequent ghost tale. But the fact that several people have encountered something supernatural in the same place, years apart, is enough to make you wonder if poor Miss Malloy may still be lingering around the area. I suppose it's one wedding day nobody's going to forget anytime soon. If you were to take a trip around Darlington, you might want to stop by North Road Station, as it is now home to a small railway museum, with various trinkets and collector's items kept in an authentic stationmaster's office, as well as Locomotion No. 1, one of the first steam locomotives built by George and Robert Stephenson. While the atmosphere around the station is warm and inviting, the station is also home to two rather bad-tempered ghosts. The station was opened for passenger service in 1842. In 1845, a ticket clerk at the station by the name of Thomas Winter was suffering from severe depression. He was at a low point one day when he was constantly berated by complaints from an irate passenger. The constant ridicule was enough to push him over the edge, and one night, he shot himself in the station toilets. His body was found the next day. A few years later, around the 1850s, a night watchman was walking alone around the station when he spotted a man dressed in uniform leave one of the station buildings. The man was accompanied by what looked like a big black Labrador. The watchman approached the man, believing he was trespassing. The man swiftly turned around and punched the watchman in the face before setting the dog on him. The dog bit viciously at the watchman's legs before being called off by the mysterious trespasser. Both the man and the dog moved away from the watchman and walked into the coal house. The watchman, shaken by what he had just experienced, felt himself over, believing he'd be bleeding from the dog bites. To his surprise, he found no bite marks, and that he seemed physically unharmed aside from falling onto the floor. He got up and ran to the coal house, only to find nobody there. After telling some of his colleagues about the incident, he learned that the man he saw matched the description of Thomas Winter, the man who'd shot himself years prior, and that his body was taken to the coal house to be wrapped in a shroud after his death. Ever since, people have said they've spotted a man in uniform and a large black dog walking together around the station at night. And to this day, locals still fear using the station at night, else risk being attacked by the angry ghost and his loyal dog. Another ghost that supposedly haunts the station is that of a young Victorian girl. An old, third-class Victorian railway carriage that was built in 1865 currently resides at the station's museum. Numerous people have spotted a young girl dressed in Victorian clothing seated in the carriage, and staff members at the museum have said they've heard the sounds of a child laughing and singing coming from inside the carriage, as well as an unsolved knocking noise. While nobody is quite sure of the origin of the little girl, I think it's fair to say she's got the right idea hiding in that carriage. Because if I was stuck haunting that station with an ill-tempered ghost, I'd probably try and stay out of their way too. So if you do want to look around a nice little museum, then by all means head over to Darlington's North Road Station. Just be careful not to annoy any rail staff that happen to have dogs with them. Trains are a fairly reliable mode of transport. I think we can all agree on that. They used to get you almost anywhere you wanted to be in the UK, and even span the entire continents of America and Europe. So it makes sense that with such reliable transport available, that the devil himself would use a train to transport some damned souls to hell. An urban legend tells the tale of a station master who was on duty one night in Newark Central Station, New Jersey. An old cowboy had been hanging around the station for a few days, not doing anything wrong, but seemingly striking a nerve with station staff just for loitering around. One night, the man was at the station in a state of panic, calling out to passers-by that it's coming for me. It's coming for me. And whenever someone asked what was after him, he would say, I've done wrong. I've killed a man that cheated me at cards, and now I'm gonna pay. By this point, the station master had enough and threatened to call the police if he didn't shut up. The old man responded with, the express train for hell is coming for my soul. You've got to help me. As the clock read 2 minutes to midnight, a loud whistle was heard coming from down the line. The next train wasn't due until 12:05, which puzzled the station master. The sound of a steam locomotive could be heard rapidly approaching the station, but nothing was seen. The old cowboy was screaming at this point, standing at the edge of the platform and staring at the oncoming noise. The station master pulled the man away from the platform, just as there was another whistle and a rush of air as if a train was speeding by. The sound of steel wheels grinding on the rails could be heard, and the presence of something big speeding past could be felt, but nothing was there. The old man gave a wail, and as the station master turned to look back at him, he was gone. Another account said that the station master was holding the man, and that he simply vanished from his arms. The train seemed to disappear down the line until nobody could hear it. When the station master checked the time, it was exactly midnight. The passengers that had witnessed the event were spooked, but the station master did his best to calm them down and convince them it was just a passing train. After the passengers settled down, it's said that the station master went to his office and poured himself a large drink before getting back to work. Odds are good that this urban legend is nothing more than a tall tale, but it is certainly one hell of a way to take someone to the afterlife. I wonder if they ever put that on the timetable after the incident. 12 a.m. express to hell. Sounds like a nice trip. Ghost trains and lingering spirits are fairly commonplace around railway stations and other infrastructure. Stations, bridges, and especially tunnels seem to be home to many supernatural things if you look for them. Usually it's some form of ghost. However, there's one old tunnel that's rumored to be home to something a little more vicious than a phantom. A vampire. The Churchill Tunnel was built in 1873 for the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway. During its construction, the tunnel faced many problems in the form of cave-ins. The ground was soft and affected by rainfall, causing it to swell after a downpour. Even after it was completed, the tunnel posed a constant safety risk to both those in and above it, and as such, was eventually abandoned after a much safer alternate route was built for the railroad by 1901. By 1925, the railroad decided to start restoring the tunnel with the intention of reusing the line. On the 2nd of October, a work train was trapped in the tunnel when part of the roof collapsed onto the locomotive, rupturing the boiler and killing the driver. The story goes that when the rescue team came in to try and save those trapped in the mess, they saw an unearthly, blood-covered humanoid creature with jagged teeth and skin hanging from its body, hunched over one of the victims. It quickly fled the tunnel, and was pursued by a group of men before it took refuge in Hollywood Cemetery, 2.2 miles away from the tunnel, hiding in a mausoleum bearing the name W. Poole, dated 1913. Some tellings of the story say that Poole was ran out of England for being a vampire. With the tomb, they reside in having a Masonic and ancient Egyptian style, making people more convinced of the vampire theory. Supposedly, the tunneling awakened an ancient evil that lived under Church Hill, and that caused the cave-in as well as the appearance of the vampire. Because there's a university campus close to the cemetery, the story quickly became popular with students, and as a result, still circulates today. As interesting as the story is, in reality, the vampire wasn't some ancient evil disturbed by the workers, but most likely Benjamin F. Mosby, the fireman on the locomotive. When the tunnel collapsed onto the locomotive, it ruptured the boiler, resulting in Mosby, who was working without a shirt on due to the heat, getting his torso badly burned with scalding steam and his teeth broken by flying debris. Witnesses said he was in shock and layers of his skin were hanging from his body. He died in hospital and was buried at the Hollywood Cemetery. The tunnel was sealed and hasn't been used since. A plan was devised in 2006 to dig up the buried locomotive, but was quickly shot down over concerns of the project causing more sinkholes. While the vampire part of the story has been disproven, the tale of Churchill Tunnel is still a very grisly one nonetheless. I feel if there is a moral to this tale, it's that some bad projects are salvageable, but some are best left alone, and to only live on as nothing more than a tall tale. If Bollywood has taught us anything, it's that India is a bizarre place. But don't let that fool you, because just like any other place, it's home to a few ghosts and scare stories of its own. Opened in 1960, the Bagankura railway station served the people of Bagankura, West Bengal, for around 7 years. The station was about as busy as you'd expect a 1960s Indian railway station to be, but just 8 years later, the station was pretty much abandoned, with no trains stopping there at all. According to local villagers, in 1967, the station master said they spotted the ghost of a woman dressed in a white sari walking along the tracks. He believed it was the spirit of a woman that had been killed in a local railway accident years prior. When he told people about it the next day, they simply blew it off as him seeing things. It wasn't until a few days later that people started to become scared, when the bodies of the station master and his family were found dead in their quarters. The station was closed shortly after, as locals didn't set foot anywhere near it in case they fell victim to the clearly hostile spirit. The local government was adamant that there wasn't a ghost lingering around the station, but it obviously wasn't enough for some people. For years, the station was left abandoned, and it wasn't until 2007, after local villagers banded together and contacted the local government, did the station reopen. Even today, the death of the station master's family and the sighting of the ghost is still enough to deter some people. No trains stop at the station after sunset, with the exception of one for late-night workers. There are few to no full-time staff employed at the station, and the building is decorated with images of several Hindu gods to ward off any evil spirits. Some paranormal investigators confirm the presence of abnormal electromagnetic waves. Others claim to see the ghost as frequently as twice a week, but some claim to have seen nothing. Though given how people have died under mysterious circumstances, I think it's fair to say there's a good chance there's something paranormal afoot. Just don't go to the station alone if you're ever passing by. Built in 1848, the York Road railway station in Belfast served as a vital hub for travel and transport across Ireland. The station was bombed during an air raid in 1941, remodeled in 1975, and closed in 1992. Just another run-of-the-mill railway station. Oh, and how could I forget? It was also haunted for a while. York Road Station was an important hub for passengers while it was in service, and like most stations, it had a few shops and cafes for commuters to stop at and pick up food, drink, and essentials for their travels. At night, however, while closing up the canteen, there's one person that didn't seem to want to leave, and as such, staff would simply leave them there while they cleaned and closed down. This was the ghost of a member of staff that was killed in the station in the 1970s during a robbery gone wrong. The worker was either shot or beaten during the robbery and ended up succumbing to their injuries. Years later, a figure was spotted in the canteen late at night by staff before it quickly vanished. It was also spotted in and around the running sheds of the station, and many members of staff claimed they could hear distant footsteps while the station was empty. Most people that encountered the ghost believed it to be the spirit of the dead staff member. After it was closed in 1992, the station was demolished, with only a nearby maintenance depot remaining that is still used by Northern Ireland Railways. It is unknown if the spirit is still in the area, but that raises the question. If you take the building away from the ghost that's haunting it, what are they to do? Hang around or finally move on? And if they do now have the option to move on, I wonder if this spirit has. Now, seeing ghosts appear after someone dies is common practice. Some spiritualist will probably end up explaining why in the comments, stuff to do with unfinished business and whatnot. But there's an old Canadian ghost story that challenges that, one where the ghosts decided to appear before anyone died. There are a few different perspectives of the story, but the tale is the same throughout most of them. It happened in May of 1908, 3 kilometers outside of Medicine Hat, Alberta. A man by the name of Gus Day worked as a fireman on the local railroad and was firing an engine pulling a train to Dunmore from Medicine Hat, with a man named Bob Tuhey driving the engine. It was late at night on a single track line. When they were around 3 kilometers outside of Medicine Hat, they saw a blazing light, similar to that of an engine's headlamp, coming down the line towards them. As it was a single track, Tuhey and Day both thought they were about to crash into an oncoming engine, when suddenly, the light sharply veered right and passed their train. The light itself was a train, seemingly floating past them on no rails. Ghostly enginemen and passengers in the carriage waved at Tuhey and Day as they passed by. Once they completed the trip, Tuhey was so frightened by the event he decided to move into yard work. One account of the story says that he went to a fortune teller shortly afterward, who told Tuhey that he'd die soon, prompting him to take some time off work. Day continued to work as a fireman on the route, until one night, 2 weeks after the initial sighting, he was firing a train being driven by a man named J. Nicholson. In the same place, just outside of Medicine Hat, the ghost train appeared again, veering right just before collision and floating past Day's engine. Both Day and Nicholson were shook by the sighting, but carried on with their work. Over a month later, on the 8th of July, 1908, Day was firing an engine in the yard when news came there had been a serious accident. 2 trains had collided head-on in a single track line 3 kilometers outside of Medicine Hat. In the exact same spot, Day had spotted the ghost trains. 7 people died in the accident, them being a few passengers, the fireman on the passenger train, and both of the engine drivers. The drivers were none other than J. Nicholson and Bob Tuhey, who had just gotten over his paranoia of the ghost train and taken up driving again. It's fair to say that Day likely never wanted to fire a freight engine or passenger train ever again, but it is a curious thought though. Can someone's ghost appear before they die? Who knows? Many stations in the UK, for one reason or another, seem to be haunted or the center of goings-on for various paranormal peoples. Most spirits have been identified, and often more than not tend to frighten staff and passengers alike. However, there's one station where its ghostly goings-on for most staff is just seen as part of the job. The Leamington Spa Railway Station is one of the more unusual of the ghost stories I've read, as there is no one specific ghost haunting the station. No notable deaths or fatal accidents have happened there, yet for whatever reason, paranormal activities have been going on in the station for several years now. Staff have reported everything from mysterious slamming doors, sounds of footsteps throughout the station when nobody else should be there, paperwork in the top office being thrown around, and lights switching on and off on their own. While not the most troublesome spirits to ever haunt a station, many people have claimed to feel their presence while in the building. The eeriest part of the station is a basement area on the 3rd platform, which is home to a partially blocked-off set of stairs that seem to go nowhere. After a while, a supernatural liaison was hired to confirm whether or not the station was actually haunted. After investigating the building, they confirmed there was something supernatural present. However, they described the ghosts as friendly with good energy. Nobody is quite sure who or what is hanging around the station, but most of the staff don't seem to mind having another worldly visitor on shift with them. When interviewed, a member of staff remarked, "I find it is often a quick and easy way to end a meeting, having a door slam for no logical reason. I've now learned to live in harmony with the ghosts." A nighttime security officer also added, "Leamington Spa Station is one of the most haunted places I have been to, and I've been to many. Whoever the ghost is, they don't seem keen on going anywhere anytime soon, but given how they seem to get along with the railway staff, I think you'll agree that perhaps this once, it might not be so bad to have a ghost hanging around." In 1858, the Western North Carolina Railroad built a large stone bridge that crossed a creek in Bostine. The bridge is around 60 feet tall and still stands today. It also happens to be home to a well-known urban legend. In 1891, a late-night passenger service crossed the bridge at around 3 a.m., with most of the passengers on board being asleep. As it crossed the bridge, the locomotive jumped the tracks and ended up plunging into the creek below, dragging several carriages down with it. 22 people were killed in the accident, either from the fall or by drowning in the creek trapped under the wreckage. The story goes that 50 years later, early in the morning of the 27th of August, 1941, a woman was waiting by her car that was pulled over at the side of the road. The car had a flat tire, and her husband had gone to find help. The bridge was close by, and the woman heard a train whistle approaching. She looked over and saw an engine's lamp approaching, and as it crossed the bridge, the train plunged off and crashed into the creek. She ran to the wreck and saw the locomotive and several old wooden carriages piled into a jagged mound, with the sound of screams and moans of injured people coming from within the pile. She approached the wreck and described the mess as terrible, with the twisted mass of metal and wood now starting to be flooded by the creek. Hearing a car pull up on the road behind her, she ran back, screaming that a terrible wreck had happened. Both her husband and a man, who owned a local store, were in the car. Both rushed over to the bridge, only to find nothing was there. Both men simply thought the wife had passed out and dreamed the whole thing. It was early in the morning after all, but the woman was adamant about what she saw. After the couple fixed the tire and set off again, she made her husband stop at the next train station. She asked the station agent if there had been a wreck that night. The agent remarked, "Funny you should ask. There was no wreck at the railroad last night, but 50 years ago today, there was a horrible wreck at Barstains Bridge." The woman promptly fainted when she realized she'd seen a ghost train. Recently, on the 27th of August, 2010, a group of 12 amateur ghost hunters gathered on the bridge in hopes of seeing the ghost train firsthand. At 2:45 a.m., a rail train came down the line at the same time they'd thought they'd seen a ghost train. The group believed it to be the ghost train and didn't flee, resulting in 2 of them getting injured and 1 of them dying. It's fair to say that it's not the most terrifying ghost story out there, but the bridge does still hold the eyes of many ghost hunters and paranormal investigators. I wonder if there's a chance anyone else will ever see the phantom train. The Clayton Tunnel of West Sussex is unique for 2 main reasons. The first being its appearance. The second thing that makes it unique isn't just the fact it's haunted, but rather the fact that it seems to be haunted by a few ghosts that don't really mind sharing their space with the living world. Measuring in at 1.3 miles in length, the tunnel was dug through a base of solid chalk, which took a total of 3 years to complete, opening in 1841. The northern tunnel entrance owes its unique castle look to the landowner who sold the area to the railway company, as he demanded that the tunnel entrance be distinctive and not just a black hole that leads into as the tunnel was being dug. A small cottage was built on top of the tunnel entrance that served as a wage office. It eventually became a mess room for the gangers while on breaks, and after the tunnel was completed, it was converted into a home. One of the head gangers that worked on the tunnel brought his wife and children over to stay in the cottage. It was later taken over by another family. In 1861, 2 trains collided in the tunnel due to a signaling error. 23 people were killed in the accident as a train slammed into the back of a passenger train that had stopped in the tunnel. The rear coach was decimated, and the locomotive that struck it was lifted up until its funnel scraped against the tunnel roof. Several of the bodies had to be kept in the basement of the cottage until they could be taken away and buried. The accident eventually resulted in a change to railway signaling rules. The accident also served as a basis for Charles Dickens' ghost story, The Signalman. Another non-fatal accident happened in the tunnel in 1926, and in 1973, 3 Territorial Army soldiers were killed in the tunnel while taking part in a map-reading exercise. Ever since these accidents, families that lived in the cottage said they've heard the sounds of shrieks, screams and metal crashing against metal echoing through the tunnel. A nearby field where the bodies of accident victims were kept is also said to be haunted. A former resident, Mrs. Muriel Atmere, who lived there for 38 years, said she loved the cottage as it was so peaceful and rural, despite the occasional rush of passing trains and the fact the place was haunted. One of the towers had a sealed-off entrance that led to an inspection tunnel for the ventilation shafts. Her family said they could frequently hear the sounds of footsteps and sighs coming from the inspection tunnel, and believed that it was the ghost of a ganger that died digging the tunnel. They could never see or identify who the ghost might be, and so they gave it the nickname of Charlie. The entrance was later doubly sealed, and Muriel would often think to herself, "Poor old Charlie, now he's stuck in there." While many have passed it off as simply wind blowing through the tunnel, Muriel contested that other spooky goings-on have happened in the cottage. She noted how she would sometimes hear a drumming noise coming from the table in the living room, as if someone was impatiently tapping their fingers on it. Muriel also spotted a faint glow coming from one of the towers on more than one occasion, saying it was in the shape of a man of medium height. Every time she saw the light, she would simply go back into the house. She said she was willing to investigate noises, but not the light. There was also a spirit she referred to as the White Lady. Muriel said she felt the presence of the spirit, but never saw it herself. 2 of her grandchildren did see the White Lady, and had to call Muriel into their bedroom one night to tell the ghost to leave. The garden that contains a small orchard of apple, pear and plum trees was also home to a sad atmosphere. It turned out that the bodies of men that died while building the tunnel were laid out in the orchard before they were sent away to be buried. Many who have lived in the house have said it's quiet and surprisingly peaceful, despite all the hauntings. Strange sounds can be heard at night, but most people put it down to animals from the nearby woods, or just air blowing through the tunnel. Clayton Tunnel remains unique among haunted railway architecture, as it doubles as not only a haunted tunnel, but also a haunted house. It must be strange living most of your life alongside ghosts, but it seems for many residents, including Mrs. Atmere, that having a few spectral housemates wasn't much of a deal breaker. Perhaps this proves that a house being haunted might not always mean it's unwelcoming, and that instead, having a ghost hanging around might sometimes give a house those quirks that make it feel a little more like a home. Railway crossings are pretty dangerous things if you're a bit dim. I mean, with gates, flashing lights and sirens, it's fairly obvious when you're not supposed to cross. Back in the old days though, most railway crossings were blocked by gates that, unless you were near a signal box, you had to manually step out of your car and open and close behind you. While the system worked, it did mean that you needed to be fast on your feet if you spotted a train thundering towards you. As you'd expect, there have been many accidents at level crossings, and it's happened that some of these accidents have been fatal. The Connington level crossing in Cambridgeshire has seen a few accidents in its time. It's a narrow crossing which makes it hard to see oncoming trains, so as you'd expect, there have been 1 or 2 fatal incidents. In the early 1940s, a truck carrying several German prisoners of war was passing over when it was struck by a train. A thick fog prevented both the engine and lorry drivers from seeing each other until it was too late. Later in 1948, a colonel was driving over the crossing and opening one of the gates when an express train came barreling towards him. He tried to get his dog out of the car before the collision, but it was too late, with both dying when the train impacted the car. It's said that both him and his dog were buried beside the line. Since the accidents, many have reported hearing voices coming from around the crossing, sometimes yelling or crying out in pain. Other people have said they've seen a 1940s Chrysler drive over the crossing, only for it to disappear halfway. There have also been reports of a ghostly man and a dog appearing around the crossing area. People living close to the crossing had also reported the gates opening and closing by themselves, as if someone was crossing. The old gates were replaced with automatic, electrical ones around the 1970s, and no new cases of the gates mysteriously opening have come forth ever since. The ghosts may just be an urban legend, but I think the story is still quite clear. Just look both ways and be careful at level crossings. I think for tonight's story, rather than read out the name of some train station and tell you who died there and that they've been seen haunting the place, I shall read a first-hand account of a driver working in the London Underground, and how their first encounter with an underground ghost was a lot more underwhelming than they thought it would be. For some unknown reason, the ghost of a young woman seems to lurk around Elephant and Castle Station in London. Rather typically, many have reported hearing strange footsteps around the station when it is empty, as well as spotting the spirit enter and walk along trains parked in the station, seemingly vanishing without getting off. Despite her supernatural nature, she just seems to be a part of the job for some people that works there. As one driver recalled, saying, "'Twas about 6 of the evening at a Bakerloo Line underground station, about a week ago. I was in pursuits of my duties as an employee of the London Underground. So I joined the train at the terminus at Elephant and Castle and walked forward to the front of the train with a view to traveling with the driver. At this point the driver has not arrived, so I put my bag down and moved to the rear door to wait for him. While I am waiting, a girl gets into the carriage. She walks straight through the carriage, and I have to move aside, making some muttered apology. I sort of have to do this since I was in uniform. A minute or so later, the driver turns up, and we move towards the front of the train. I notice that the girl is not in the carriage, and this is a rather immediate cause for concern. She could not have left the train without passing me. I had a full view of the carriage and platform at the time. My reaction was to inform the driver. The only place she could have gone was to have walked down the tunnel. Not really what we want. The driver's response was unusual. "Oh, her. We hear about her all the time. She's even been in the papers." Lovely. My first real ghost is a media celebrity, and it must be said, very, very boring indeed. Niagara Falls is a beautiful place to visit if you want to be in the one place in the world that's guaranteed to make you want to pee. If you wander around the area, you'll come across a railway line belonging to Canadian National Railways, and running under that railway is a small little tunnel that's home to a rather unhappy ghost. When the line was being built in the early 1800s by the Grand Trunk Railway, several tunnels needed to be built under raised sections of the track. These are to allow water to properly drain from one side of the embankment to the other, as well as let local farmers safely move supplies and livestock to the other side of the tracks without the need to pass over the busy rail line. A local legend tells that one of these tunnels is haunted by the ghost of a farmer's daughter. The story goes that the farmhouse caught fire one night, and the girl fled while engulfed in flames. She ran until she collapsed in the nearby tunnel, where she promptly burnt to death. Other tellings of the story say that the girl was set on fire by her father in a fit of anger during a messy divorce, while another says she was raped in the tunnel, killed, and her body was burned to hide the evidence. Whatever the story, if you stand in the middle of the tunnel and strike a match, the ghost of the girl will blow it out and begin to scream. Distant screams have also been heard by local residents and passers-by originating from the tunnel. This earned it the nickname of the Screaming Tunnel, and has since become a small area of interest for paranormal investigators. Despite the conflicting stories, the main thread of them all involving a girl being burned is enough to keep people coming to see if the rumors are true. Whatever the story, perhaps we should stop striking matches around the tunnel and maybe just give the poor girl a break, eh? To any British rail enthusiast, the name Crewe is one with some significance. Home to one of the most important locomotive foundries, Crewe earned its place on the map for building everything from tank engines to goods locomotives, and even the famous LMS Princess Coronation Express locomotives. Naturally, the surrounding area would become famous as well, but not for the same reasons. For whatever reason, there have been hundreds of ghost stories and sightings at Crewe's railway station, with some saying they've spotted a phantom cat that seems to appear and disappear as it pleases. Others have seen children's footsteps appear inexplicably, and many believe there are secret tunnels under the station that too are haunted. An old elevator shaft located in the station is the key part in the tunnel theory, as many believe that it was formerly a private lift built into the station that accessed secret tunnels built underneath the platforms to allow for the royal family to travel safely. The old shaft is now home to the most eerie part of the station, as a wailing howl can be heard coming from it. People have investigated the area thinking it was a lost animal, but found nothing. A former station master remarked that the whole place had a sense of dread about it, and that working there wasn't for the faint of heart. Virgin Trains eventually called in a paranormal investigator to ease the minds of staff. The investigator confirmed the presence of something supernatural in the building, and frequently keeps check on the station. What exactly the supernatural entities are that are hanging around the station isn't quite known, but one thing is for certain, that wailing howl from the lift certainly doesn't make me want to find out. Not every ghost that haunts the rails was necessarily killed by a train. Some, like William Therese, died in some other way and ended up with their spirits stuck lingering around some railway. Some of these ghosts, however, didn't die easily, and the ghost of King's Cross is a bleak reminder. On the 18th of November, 1987, a fire broke out in the tube station of King's Cross Street, Pancras in London. It's believed that either a lit match or a cigarette was dropped down the side of one of the wooden escalators, causing a fire to start underneath it. The fire couldn't be reached with an extinguisher, and a fire brigade was soon summoned. Because the fire was under the escalator, it took a while for the firemen to get to it. Around 3 minutes after the firefighters arrived, the police decided to evacuate the station, and 3 minutes later, by 7:42 p.m., the entire escalator was on fire, producing superheated gas that built up against the ceiling. The paint was burned away, uncovering many layers of old paint beneath it, which quickly went up in flames, producing thick, red-hot black smoke. The sudden ignition of the paint killed and injured several people still trapped underground, with many having to escape via train. It wasn't until 1:46 a.m. that the fire was finally put out. 31 people died in the fire, and roughly 100 were injured. An inquiry was launched, and many stations quickly had to replace their wooden escalators with modern metal ones. Many other overlooked safety regulations were rewritten, and the underground trains were made significantly safer. Many years later, after the fire, in 1998, a lady was traveling through the station when she said she spotted another woman visibly distressed. The distressed woman was dressed in regular 80s clothes, but also screaming with her arms outstretched. The lady approached the distressed woman to see if she was okay, only for a passenger to walk straight through the woman as if she wasn't there. The ghost was also spotted by another gentleman, again seeing a normal-looking woman crying into her hands. As he approached the woman to try and comfort her, he simply passed through her before she disappeared. There are some who say they can still smell smoke in the station, where the fire broke out despite it being years after the blaze. Whether it's only one ghost in King's Cross, or all 31 of the victims still haunting the place, is yet to be truly known. Let's hope that you're not stuck in the last moments of your life before you become a ghost, because being trapped in a station inferno for eternity doesn't sound pleasant to me. Not every ghost haunts the same. While some ghosts are content to just walk around, some like to be disruptive by banging doors, sending chills up your spine, or simply going boo. There are some ghosts, however, that take disruptive haunting to another level. It was a rainy night in 1867, just outside of Meso, North Carolina. Conductor Joe Baldwin was riding in the caboose at the back of a goods train late one night headed towards Wilmington, keeping the time and sorting out paperwork. He suddenly noticed that the train seemed to be slowing down, only to find that the caboose had become uncoupled from the rest of the train and was slowly coming to a stop along the line. His biggest concern wasn't being stranded, but rather the passenger train that was scheduled to follow shortly behind his goods train. If it hit his caboose at full speed, there would likely be a fatal accident. Choosing to prevent the crash, Baldwin stood at the back of his caboose and waved his red light to warn the oncoming train. The driver spotted Baldwin, but it was too late for him to stop completely, causing him to collide with Baldwin's caboose. The driver had slowed the train down enough to minimize damage and save his passengers, but Baldwin died in the collision, having been decapitated in the wreck. His lantern was flung out of his hand and into the nearby swamp. The accident was quickly cleared, and he was buried a few days later. Some accounts of the story say that his head was never found. After the accident, local residents said they spotted a white light appear along the section of track close to the collision. The light appeared frequently, and rumors started to circulate that it was Joe Baldwin's ghost searching for his missing head. The light was later reported as appearing far in the distance and floating around 5 feet off the ground as it moved east along the tracks. Some sightings even spotted it approaching Meso Station before disappearing or moving back down the line. Some people and railroad workers have said they've spotted 2 lights along the track, with the lights being bright enough for some engine drivers to see them and stop their trains, thinking it was someone signaling them to stop. Eventually, the railroad started to use red and green lights to signal drivers, as the ghost lights were disrupting so many services. Supposedly, while President Grover Cleveland's train was picking up fuel and water at Meso, the president spotted the odd signal lights, and when he inquired about them, was told the story of Joe Baldwin. Some accounts of the story say that the president spotted the ghost himself. The ghost has been a frequent sight around Meso, with people stating they too have seen the infamous light. In 1964, a ghost hunter by the name of Hans Halser was contacted to confirm whether the ghost was real. Halser cited how frequently the ghost had been spotted and as such confirmed of its existence. In 1980, that segment of the railroad was no longer in use, and as such the rails were pulled up. Since then, sightings of the ghost have greatly diminished, with only a few people spotting the light here and there. Some have proposed a more logical explanation that gas being released by the nearby swamp was refracting lights from the nearby town and highway. While there have been experiments done that give this theory some merit, many first-hand witnesses to the ghost light noted how the light looked distinctly like that of a kerosene lamp and not like other lights in the area. Maybe people were just seeing things going up and down the line. Maybe it's a hoax, maybe it's real. Whatever the case, if the ghost of Joe Baldwin is still out there, looking for his head, then I wish the best of luck to him, because he certainly needs it. The London Underground has been around for a long time, and is one of the most important means of public transport throughout the City of London. It also seems to be one of the most haunted areas in London, sometimes through chance, but sometimes through tragedy. During the Second World War, many of London's underground stations were used as air raid shelters throughout the Blitz. They were deep underground, spacious enough to accommodate hundreds of people, and the tunnels could be used as emergency exits in the event the entrance was blocked off by rubble. On the 3rd of March, 1943, 500 people were already taking shelter in Bethnal Green Station when at 9 p.m., the air raid siren sounded. Authorities were directing local residents to the station to take cover. More than 1,500 people went to Bethnal Green to seek shelter. This wasn't a problem, as the station had 5,000 bunks and was capable of sheltering up to 7,000 people if needed. What was an issue was the sudden influx of people and the rain. As everyone was making their way down the steps into the station, an anti-aircraft rocket was fired, making a distinct whistling sound. With sirens going off and planes overhead, people panicked thinking it was a dropping bomb and tried to rush into the station. The rain, however, made the stairs wet and slippery. All it took was one person to trip over. The person behind them was pushed into them, causing them to slip too. It was a domino effect of people falling down the stairs and piling on top of each other. But the pile kept on growing as people were pushed into the station by others outside trying to escape the danger. The growing weight of the mess crushed the people at the bottom of the pile to death. But the people outside weren't aware of the accident and kept pushing down into the station. More and more people ended up in the pile, and as a result, more and more people were crushed to death. A total of 173 people died, 27 men, 48 women, and 62 children. To quell the public backlash, the government said a bomb had gone off, resulting in the deaths of so many, rather than admitting the accident happened. It wasn't until 2013 a memorial was placed in the station, marking the loss of those caught up in the crush. Years later, around 1981, a station master was finishing his duties late one night. The rest of the staff had gone home, and he was doing his rounds, turning off lights and securing entrances and exits. He returned to his office to sign off some papers when he heard what sounded like children sobbing. He brushed it off as nothing, but the sound kept getting louder and louder. Then suddenly, female voices and screams joined those of the children's. The sound became louder and more frantic, lasting almost 15 minutes until the station master panicked and ran to the booking hallway to escape the noise. Many other staff working at the station have also reported hearing the dreadful sounds of women and children screaming for their lives echoing throughout the station on late, lonely nights. I think the message to take away from this is to always keep your cool, watch your step, and be careful when you're in a rush, because you certainly don't want to be at the bottom of the pile. Preston, Lancashire is a fairly busy place. It's been around for a while, and many people live there. In the middle of Preston, you can also find the Miley Tunnel, which is home to a lot of overgrowth, a few rats, and a well-known local legend. In 1836, the Preston and Longridge Railway Company were set up to build a line from a nearby quarry to Preston. The line required the construction of 3 tunnels, totaling 788 meters in length. The only things separating the tunnel are some gaps for ventilation. The railway was frequently used for transporting freight and quarry stone, but was also known to carry passengers from 1856 onwards. In 1866, a 15-year-old girl by the name of Margaret Banks fell from a train carriage while passing through a station and was dragged to her death by the train. The railway stopped running passenger trains in the 1930s as buses became the preferred method of transport for the locals. The line was still used for freight and goods until it was finally closed in 1980. Local legend says that you can sometimes hear the screams of the girl who was dragged to her death echoing through the tunnels. Many have said they've spotted the ghost of a woman in and around the tunnel entrances, who has come to be known as the Grey Lady. Supposedly, she beckons and welcomes people into the tunnel, but has never been reported as malicious. Those who have entered the tunnel remarked about the feelings of unease they have experienced, and that it has a strange energy. I found a blog post written by a Joseph Stashko in 2010, recounting the time he and a friend investigated the tunnel. Stashko said he wasn't a big believer in the supernatural, but went on to say that his friend managed to capture a blue light moving through the tunnel on camera. After investigating the area, they found no crack, hole, or opening for the light to have come from, so it's very possible they saw the Grey Lady herself. In recent times, plans have been going round to relay the old railway line and tunnel as part of new tramway. What this means for the Grey Lady, though, I'm not sure. Maybe she'll enjoy having some more visitors pass through. In the meantime, if any of you decide to try and see this local legend for yourself, don't forget to say hello for me. The only thing more annoying than missing your train is waiting to catch a train on an empty platform, only to turn around and find you're surrounded by ghosts. If, however, you decide to catch a late-night train from New Street Station in Birmingham, you might end up in such an unfortunate situation. When the original station was being built in 1848, a Jewish cemetery needed to be dug up in order to make space for the station's foundations. If anyone listening understands the basics of the spirit world, shunting around corpses and messing in graveyards is not a very good idea. Because of this, many believe that the entire station building is cursed. The area has an air of unease about it, the most chilling place being Platform 4. Throughout the years, people have committed suicide in the station building, specifically on Platform 4. The first was a gentleman by the name of Claude, who poisoned himself around the Victorian period for unknown reasons. One of the most well-documented deaths took place around the late 1940s, involving a former engine driver by the name of Walter Hartles, who at the age of 68, shot himself in the chest in the waiting room after going through some messy marital issues. Along with those who have taken their own lives, a fatal collision happened in the station in 1921, killing 3 people. While most would simply call it a tragic accident, there are some more spiritual people who may believe it was the angry and disturbed spirits from the old graveyard getting a little payback. During the 60s, the station was rebuilt to look more modern, but after being branded as an eyesore in the early 2000s, it was rebuilt again to look more modern. Despite these changes, the ghosts of both Claude and Walter have still been seen around the station after dark, both wearing clothes that fit the era. Many people walking past the waiting room often say they see an old man sitting alone before he fades away. A séance was planned a few years ago in order to contact the spirits, but was cancelled over safety concerns. It's fair to say that not many people fully believe in curses and cursed buildings, but given its history and what it's built on, it wouldn't be a stretch to say that New Street Station may well be cursed. Let's just hope none of the staff decide to reenact The Shining anytime soon. Nottinghamshire is famous for being the place where Robin Hood would poach deer and dodge taxis. And just like every old famous place in the UK, it's also home to a few ghosts from Woollerton Hall, Trent Bridge, and the National Justice Museum. But of course, the ones we're interested in today are those that hang around Ralston Station. On the 5th of December, 1874, John Bradwell, a senior church warden, was walking along the rail foot crossing to the other side of the station. Him being almost deaf meant he didn't hear an oncoming train which knocked him down. He was taken to Newark Station where a surgeon was waiting to treat him, but Bradwell died of his injuries by the time he had arrived. Many years later, an accident took place on the station's level crossing involving a train colliding with a lorry. The driver of the lorry was killed in the collision. Ever since, station masters, staff and local residents have reported seeing several ghosts appearing in and around the station. The first is the ghost of the lorry driver, standing in the place where the accident happened. The other ghost that has been spotted is the phantom of a smartly dressed man carrying a newspaper. The ghost is said to appear on the platform and disappear just as quickly. It is also reported that a ghost train passes through the station from time to time. A crossing keeper was on duty when they heard the sound of a steam locomotive approaching. He could hear it slow down and stop at the station, even smelling the coal and steam. Yet, looking around, he couldn't see a train anywhere. The spirits' presence don't seem malicious, and as such, folks just don't mind them if they see them. We at least have an explanation for why the lorry driver and the ghost train may appear from time to time. However, the gentleman with the newspaper still remains a mystery. For all our sakes, though, let's just hope he doesn't look like this. And now, not the story of a ghost train, but of a ghost tunnel. Hoosac in Native American roughly translates to pile of rocks. However, many have mistranslated it over the years as meaning forbidden thanks to the Hoosac Tunnel. Seemingly two very different things, a pile of rocks and being forbidden, but it's fair to say people started calling it the Forbidden Tunnel for a bloody good reason. Construction of the tunnel began in 1851 and started fairly slow. The rock was very hard and unyielding. So much progress wasn't made until the introduction of nitroglycerin into mining, with the Hoosac Tunnel being the first to use nitroglycerin in its construction. Things were going fine until the 20th of March, 1865, when three explosive experts named Ned Brinkman, Billy Nash, and Ringo Kelly used nitroglycerin to progress their section of tunnel. As they set the nitro and ran back to the safety bunker, Ringo made it to the bunker first, and rather than wait for the others, he set off the charges early, burying Brinkman and Nash alive under the falling rock. After the accident, Ringo vanished without a trace, leading many to think it was an intentional act of murder. Whether it was just an accident or not is still unknown. Some accounts of the story say it was 10 days later when Ringo showed up again. Others say it was a year later. Either way, he was eventually found, with workmen discovering his corpse 2 miles deep into the tunnel where Brinkman and Nash had died. Ringo had been strangled to death, and the police deduced that he had died around 3:30 in the morning. No suspects were ever found, and the crime remains unsolved. Rumors started to circulate among the construction crew that the vengeful spirits of Brinkman and Nash had lured Ringo back into the tunnel to kill him. As such, some men started to believe that the tunnel was cursed and left the digging site, with other men flat out refusing to enter, especially after dark. In 1868, an engineer and respected officer during the Civil War named Paul Travers received a letter from Mr. Dunn, the man in charge of the tunnel project, in the hopes that Travers would investigate it after workmen started to complain of hearing a man's voice cry out in agony. Progress had slowed down because of this. Dunn was convinced that it was just the wind, but the men wouldn't listen, so he hoped a visit from Travers would put them right. Travers and Dunn entered the tunnel at 9 p.m. on the 8th of September. Travers wrote a letter to his sister afterwards recalling the events of that evening. Dunn and I entered the tunnel at exactly 9 p.m. We traveled about 2 miles into the shaft when we stopped to listen. As we stood there in the cold silence, we both heard what truly sounded like a man groaning out in pain. As you know, I have heard this same sound many times during the war. Yet, when we turned up the wicks on our lamps, there were no other human beings in the shaft except Mr. Dunn and myself. I'll admit, I haven't been this frightened since Shiloh. Mr. Dunn agreed that it wasn't the wind we heard. Perhaps Nash and Brinkman? I wonder. Work continued until a month later when the worst accident in its construction took place. A gas explosion blew up the water pumping station on the surface, which killed 13 miners after the debris filled the tunnel they were working in. A miner was lowered into the shaft in an attempt to find any survivors, but was brought back to the surface a few minutes later, barely conscious from the fumes, only able to gasp no hope to the rescue team. As the shaft started to fill with water, some of the bodies floated to the surface. The last body wasn't found until over a year later. During the year the bodies were still missing, local villagers told tales of vague shapes and muffled wails coming from the water-filled pit. Workmen claimed to see the lost miners carrying picks and shovels through the mist and snow of the mountaintop. The ghosts would appear and vanish, leaving no footprints in the snow and not answering to calls. Strangely, after the last body was found and properly buried, the apparitions stopped appearing, although the eerie moans coming from the tunnel continued to keep workmen terrified. A man by the name of Dr. Clifford J. Owens visited the tunnel on the 25th of June, 1872, accompanied by James R. McKinstry, a drilling superintendent. It's not known exactly why they visited the tunnel, but it was likely a shared interest in the ghost stories surrounding it. As they both reached 2 miles deep into the tunnel, they stopped to rest. The only lights in the tunnel were their dim lanterns. Dr. Owens described the place as being as cold and as dark as a tomb. As they were talking and resting, they heard a strange and mournful sound that Dr. Owens described as sounding like someone in great pain. He then said, "The next thing I saw was a dim light coming along the tunnel in a westerly direction. At first, I believed it was probably a workman with a lantern. Yet, as the light grew closer, it took on a strange blue color and appeared to change in shape into the form of a human being with no head. The light supposedly got close enough for them to touch it, staying motionless for a moment as if it was watching them before it continued toward the east end of the tunnel, eventually vanishing." Dr. Owens later stated that he was, above all, a realist, and that he was not prone to repeating wild tales and gossip that defied reasonable explanation, but he admitted he was unable to deny what he and McKinstry saw that night. In 1874, close to the tunnel's completion, a local hunter named Frank Webster vanished near the mountain. 3 days later, he was found by a search party. In a state of shock, mumbling incoherently, and stumbling along the banks of the Deerfield River. When he came to his senses, he explained that strange voices had ordered him into the Hoosac Tunnel, and that once inside, he saw ghostly figures wandering around. He then said that invisible hands had snatched his hunting rifle and beat him with it. He was found with injuries matching that of a beating. Webster said he didn't remember leaving the tunnel. Later the same year, both tunnel headings were completed, and by the 9th of February, 1875, the first train went through the tunnel. The news called the tunnel the Western Gateway to the rest of New England, but eerie things still went on. In the fall of that year, a fire tender was taking a wagon load of wood into the tunnel when he suddenly turned his team and horses around and rushed them out. The team and wagons were later found in the forest, but the fire tender was nowhere to be seen. For years, stories of ghosts and mysterious goings-on surrounded the tunnel, although the ghosts weren't always malicious. An employee of the railroad named Joseph Impoko frequently worked around the tunnel and was moving ice away from the tracks one day when a voice called to him, "Run, Joe, run." He turned to see an engine rapidly approaching him, just managing to jump out of the way. When he tried to see who shouted his name, he saw nobody and noted that the engine was too loud and too far away for it to have been the driver calling to him. 6 weeks after the incident, he was using a crowbar to free some freight cars that were frozen to the tracks, when the same voice frantically called out, "Joe, Joe. Drop it, Joe." He immediately let go of his crowbar as it was suddenly thrown against the wall of the tunnel. It turned out a power line had overheated and shorted out, causing more than 11,000 volts to be sent through the rails. Joe soon left his job and took up work outside of the area, but visited the tunnel every year as an homage to the ghost that had saved his life. He was certain that if he didn't do it, some tragedy would befall him. In 1977, his wife fell ill, and so he decided to stay at home with her instead of visiting the tunnel as he usually would do. His wife died in October of that year, and he believed she died because he had failed to visit the tunnel. In 1976, a paranormal researcher visited the tunnel and claims to have come face to face with a figure of a man in old-fashioned working clothes, backlit by a brilliant white light. In 1984, another researcher entered the tunnel with a railroad official, saying she felt the uncomfortable sensation of someone standing close to her the whole time. Another group of students left a tape recorder in the tunnel overnight, and when reviewing the recordings, said they heard what seemed to be muffled human voices. Strange sights and eerie feelings still surround the tunnel to this day. Despite this, it is still heavily used by the Boston and Maine Railroad. Overall, over 200 men died digging the 4.7-mile tunnel, which took 25 years to complete. The tunnel earned the nickname of the Blood Pit, and still to this day remains as one of the most haunted places in the U.S. So even though its name only means pile of rocks, I feel like Forbidden is a lot better fitting, mostly because the tunnel has certainly earned that name. The gentle sway of the train car had always been soothing to me. As a regional sales manager for a large pharmaceutical company, I spent more time on the railways than I did in my own bed. The rhythmic clack of wheels on tracks was my lullaby, the ever-changing landscape outside my window a constant companion. This particular Tuesday evening found me on yet another overnight train, heading from Chicago to New York for a critical meeting. I settled into my usual routine, laptop out, spreadsheets open, a cup of mediocre coffee cooling on the fold-down tray. The first sign that something was amiss came about 3 hours into the journey. I glanced at my watch, frowning slightly. We should have reached Cleveland by now, but the cityscape outside remained stubbornly rural. Fields and forests rolled by, bathed in the eerie glow of a full moon. I flagged down a passing attendant, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and a pinched expression. "Excuse me," I said, "but shouldn't we have reached Cleveland by now?" She gave me a strange look, her eyes slightly unfocused. "Cleveland? I'm sorry, sir, but I'm not familiar with that stop. Perhaps you're thinking of a different route?" Before I could respond, she hurried away, disappearing into the next car. I sat back, puzzled. How could she not know Cleveland? It was a major stop on this line. I shook my head, chalking it up to a new employee's confusion, and returned to my work. As the hours ticked by, my unease grew. The landscape outside never changed, an endless loop of moonlit fields and shadowy forests. My phone had lost signal long ago, and my watch seemed to be malfunctioning, its hands spinning wildly before stopping altogether. I decided to stretch my legs, hoping a walk through the train might clear my head. As I made my way through the cars, I noticed how eerily quiet it was. The few passengers I saw sat motionless in their seats, staring blankly ahead or out the windows. In the dining car, I found an elderly man hunched over a cup of coffee. His wrinkled hands trembled slightly as he lifted the mug to his lips. "Excuse me," I said, sliding into the seat across from him. "I don't mean to bother you, but have you noticed anything strange about this journey?" The old man's rheumy eyes focused on me, a flicker of recognition passing across his face. "You're new, aren't you?" he said, his voice a dry whisper. "First time on this line?" I nodded, a chill running down my spine. "What do you mean this line? This is just the regular Chicago to New York route, isn't it?" He let out a wheezed laugh that turned into a cough. "Oh my boy," he said, shaking his head. "This ain't no regular route. This here's the last line. Ain't no New York where we're headed." "I don't understand," I said, my heart beginning to race. "Where are we going then?" The old man leaned in close, the smell of stale coffee on his breath. "Nowhere," he whispered. "Everywhere. This train doesn't stop, son. It just keeps on going round and round, world without end." I jerked back, convinced I was dealing with a madman. "That's impossible," I said. "Every train has to stop eventually." He just smiled, a sad, knowing expression. "You go on believing that if it makes you feel better. But mark my words, you'll see. We all figure it out sooner or later." I stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over my chair. "You're crazy," I muttered, backing away. "This is just a normal train. We'll be in New York by morning." As I turned to leave, the old man called out, "What's your name, son?" I hesitated for a moment before answering. "Jack. Jack Thurston." He nodded slowly. "Well, Jack Thurston, I'm Howard. I'll be seeing you around. We've got all the time in the world, after all." I hurried back to my seat, Howard's words echoing in my mind. It was nonsense, of course. Trains didn't just go on forever. There had to be a rational explanation for the delays and the strange behavior of the staff. As I sank into my seat, I noticed a young woman across the aisle, furiously scribbling in a notebook. Her long, dark hair fell in a curtain around her face, and her leg bounced with nervous energy. "Excuse me," I said, leaning towards her. "I don't suppose you know when we're due to arrive in New York, do you?" She looked up, her eyes wide and slightly manic. "New York," she repeated, letting out a hysterical giggle. "Oh, honey, there is no New York. Not anymore. There's only the train." I felt my blood run cold. "What are you talking about?" She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I've been on this train for, I don't know how long. Days? Weeks? It all blurs together. But I figured it out. We're not going anywhere. We're stuck in a loop, a never-ending journey to nowhere." I shook my head, refusing to believe it. "That's impossible. You're just confused. Maybe you fell asleep and missed your stop." She laughed again, a sound devoid of humor. "Oh, I wish it were that simple. But look around you. Have you seen anyone get off? Have we stopped at any stations? This isn't a normal train, Jack. This is something else entirely." I started at the sound of my name. "How do you know my name?" She smiled, a sad, knowing expression. "I heard you talking to old Howard in the dining car. I'm Lisa, by the way. Welcome aboard the Eternal Express." I stood up abruptly, my head spinning. "This is insane. All of you are insane. I'm going to find the conductor and get some answers." As I stormed off towards the front of the train, I heard Lisa call out behind me. "Good luck with that, but don't say I didn't warn you." I made my way through car after car, each one identical to the last. The same faded blue seats, the same flickering overhead lights, the same blank-faced passengers staring in nothingness. How long had I been walking? It felt like hours, but that was impossible in a train of normal length. Finally, I reached what should have been the engine car. But instead of a locomotive, I found myself in another passenger car, exactly like all the others. I spun around, disoriented. How could this be? A hand on my shoulder made me jump. I turned to find the attendant from earlier, her pinched face now twisted into an unnaturally wide smile. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice sickly sweet. "I need to speak to the conductor," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "There's been some kind of mistake. This train should have reached New York by now." Her smile never wavered. "I'm sorry, sir, but there is no conductor, and there is no mistake. You're exactly where you're supposed to be." I backed away from her, my heart pounding. "What is this place? What's happening?" She tilted her head, her eyes suddenly black and empty. "This is the last line, Mr. Thurston. The train that never stops, never ends. You bought a ticket, and now you're on the ride of eternity." I turned and ran, pushing past confused passengers, my breath coming in ragged gasps. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a dream, a hallucination, anything but reality. I burst into the space between cars, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. The door to the next car was just a few feet away. If I could just reach it, maybe I could find a way off this nightmare train. But as I stepped forward, the gap between the cars suddenly seemed to stretch. The next door moved further and further away, no matter how fast I ran. The wind howled around me, drowning out my screams of frustration and fear. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my arm, yanking me back into the car. I fell to the floor, gasping for breath. Lisa stood over me, her face pale in the flickering light. "Are you crazy?" she hissed. "You can't go out there. Between the cars, that's where it gets you." "Where what gets you?" I asked, my voice shaking. She helped me to my feet, glancing nervously at the door. "The thing that runs this train, the thing that brought us all here. Trust me, you don't want to meet it." As if on cue, a low, rumbling sound echoed through the car. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, part machine, part animal. All wrong. The lights flickered more intensely, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw something massive moving in the shadows between the cars. Lisa pulled me back to our seats, her grip on my arm almost painful. "Listen to me," she said urgently. "I know this is hard to accept. God knows I fought against it for, I don't even know how long, but fighting only makes it worse. You'll have to accept where you are, or you'll go mad." I slumped into my seat, my mind reeling. "But why? Why is this happening? What is this place?" She shook her head. "I don't know. None of us do. All we know is that we're here, on this never-ending journey. Some think it's hell, others purgatory. Old Howard thinks it's some kind of cosmic mistake. Me? I think it's just the universe's way of saying tough luck, kiddo." I looked out the window, watching the same moonlit landscape roll by. How many times had I seen those same fields, those same trees? How long would I continue to see them? "So what do we do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Lisa gave me a sad smile. "We ride, we talk, we try to stay sane. And we hope that maybe, just maybe, one day we'll reach the last stop." As the train rolled on into the endless night, I realized with a sinking heart that my journey had only just begun. And the destination? That remained a terrifying mystery. Days blended into nights and nights into days. The monotonous rhythm of the train became the backdrop to my existence. I lost count of how many times I'd watched the same scenery roll by. How many times I'd walked the length of the train, hoping to find something, anything different. Lisa became my anchor in this sea of madness. We spent hours talking, sharing stories of our lives before the train. She'd been a journalist, always chasing the next big story. "Guess I found it," she would say with a bitter laugh, gesturing at our surroundings. Old Howard joined us often, his weathered face a map of the time he'd spent on this hellish journey. "Been riding this rail for longer than I can remember," he'd say, his rheumy eyes distant. "Seen folks come and go, some just disappear, others," he'd trail off shaking his head. I learned to fear the spaces between the cars. Sometimes, late at night when the train's rhythm seemed to falter, we'd hear things, scraping, slithering sounds. Once I caught a glimpse of something massive and dark undulating past the windows. Lisa pulled me away before I could get a better look. "Trust me," she said, her face pale, "you don't want to know." The other passengers were a mix of the resigned and the mad. Some, like us, tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Others had given in to despair, sitting in the same spots day after day, staring blankly at nothing. And then there were those who'd lost their minds entirely, prowling the cars with wild eyes and incoherent ramblings. One such soul was a man we called the preacher, tall and menacing, with a tangled beard and eyes that burned with fanatical fervor. He would roam the train, shouting about sin and redemption. "We're all here for a reason," he'd bellow, spittle flying from his lips. "This is our punishment, our penance. Repent, and maybe, just maybe, you'll find your way off this damn train." Most ignored him, but some listened. I watched as he gathered a small following, passengers desperate for any explanation, any hope of escape. I was on what I guessed to be my 100th day on the train that things took a darker turn. I was jolted awake by screams coming from the front of the car. Lisa was already on her feet, her face a mask of terror. "They've done it," she whispered. "They've actually done it." I followed her gaze to see a group of the preacher's followers dragging a struggling passenger towards the door between cars. The preacher stood by, his arms raised, chanting something I couldn't make out over the victim's screams. "What are they doing?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "A sacrifice," Old Howard said, his voice grim. "Fools think they can appease whatever's running this train, by their way off with blood." I started to move towards them, but Lisa held me back. "Don't," she hissed. "There's nothing we can do." Just don't watch. But I couldn't look away. The group reached the door, and with a final triumphant cry from the preacher, they shoved their victim out into the space between the cars. For a moment, nothing happened. Then came a sound, a wet, tearing noise that would haunt my dreams for days to come. The door slammed shut, cutting off the screams. The preacher turned to face the rest of us, his eyes wild with excitement. "It is done," he shouted. "The unworthy has been cast out. Soon we shall reach our final destination." But the train rolled on unchanged. Hours passed, then days. No final stop, no salvation. Just the endless journey and the growing madness of the preacher and his flock. More sacrifices followed. The train's population dwindled as passenger after passenger was thrown to whatever lurked between the cars. Those of us who refused to join the creature's cult banded together, watching each other's backs, sleeping in shifts. It was during one of my watch shifts that I first saw her. A little girl, no more than 7 or 8, wandering alone through the car. Her pink dress was pristine, her blonde hair neatly braided. She looked so out of place in this nightmare that, for a moment, I thought I was hallucinating. "Hello," I said softly, not wanting to scare her. "Are you lost?" She turned to me, and I had to stifle a gasp. Her eyes were completely black, like empty voids in her small face. When she spoke, her voice was old, ancient even. "Lost?" she repeated, tilting her head. "No, I don't think so. I know exactly where I am." "Do you?" I felt a chill run down my spine. "What are you?" I whispered. She smiled, revealing teeth that were just a bit too sharp. "I'm a passenger, just like you. We're all passengers here, Jack. All of us, riding the rails to eternity." "How do you know my name?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "I know everyone's name," she said, her black eyes boring into mine. "I know why they're here. I know their sins, their fears, their deepest, darkest secrets." She took a step closer. "Would you like to know yours, Jack?" I backed away, my heart pounding. "Stay away from me," I said, my voice shaking. She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, Jack, you can't run from me. You can't run from any of this. You bought your ticket. Now you have to ride." I blinked and she was gone, just vanished as if she'd never been there at all. I slumped in my seat, my mind reeling. Was I losing it? Had I finally snapped, like so many others on this godforsaken train? I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, Lisa was shaking me awake. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Jack," she said urgently, "something's happening. The train, it's slowing down." I sat up, suddenly alert. She was right. For the first time since this nightmare began, I could feel the train decelerating. The familiar clack of wheels on tracks was slowing, becoming more distinct. Passengers were stirring, looking around in confusion and hope. Even the preacher and his followers had stopped their mad ranting, staring out the windows with a mix of fear and anticipation. "Are we stopping?" I asked, hardly daring to believe it. Old Howard shook his head, his expression grim. "Don't get your hopes up, son. In all my time here, I've never known this train to stop. Whatever's happening, it ain't gonna be good." As if to punctuate his words, the lights in the car began to flicker more intensely than ever before. The temperature dropped rapidly, our breath fogging in the suddenly frigid air. And then, with a great screeching of metal on metal, the train ground to a halt. For a moment, there was absolute silence. We all held our breath, waiting, hoping, fearing. Then, with a hiss of hydraulics, the doors slid open. Finally, the preacher cried, pushing his way towards the exit. "Our salvation is at hand. Come, brothers and sisters, let us." His words were cut off by a scream of pure terror. As he stepped off the train, something grabbed him, something huge and dark and impossible. In the blink of an eye, he was gone, leaving behind nothing but a spreading pool of blood on the platform. Chaos erupted. Passengers pushed and shoved, some trying to get off the train, others desperately attempting to close the doors. I lost sight of Lisa in the pandemonium. And through it all, I heard laughter. That same glass-like sound from before. I turned to see the little girl with black eyes, standing calmly in the middle of the mayhem. "Welcome to the last stop, Jack," she said, her voice cutting through the screams and cries. "Are you ready to get off?" As I stared into those bottomless black eyes, I realized with dawning horror that our endless journey had only been the beginning. The real nightmare was just starting. And somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of a train whistle, signaling the departure to our next unknown destination. The chaos around me faded into a dull roar as I stared into the little girl's black eyes. Time seemed to slow, and in that moment I had a sudden, crystal-clear realization. This was a test. The endless train ride, the maddening repetition, the horrors we'd witnessed. It had all been leading to this moment of choice. "No," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I'm not getting off. Not here. Not like this." The girl's smile faltered for a split second, a crack in her otherworldly composure. "You don't have a choice, Jack. Everyone has to get off eventually." I stood my ground, even as I heard more screams from the platform, more passengers being dragged into the darkness. "There's always a choice. You told me I bought a ticket for this ride. Well, I'm not ready for it to end." Her eyes narrowed. "You can't stay on the train forever, Jack. It doesn't work like that." "Watch me," I growled, turning away from her and pushing through the panicked crowd. I had to find Lisa and Howard. We'd survived this long together. I wasn't about to leave them behind now. I spotted Howard first, huddled in the corner, his eyes wide with terror. "Come on," I said, grabbing his arm. "We need to move." "Where?" he asked, his voice trembling. "There's nowhere to go. It's got us. It's finally got us." I shook him, perhaps more roughly than I intended. "Listen to me. This isn't the end. It's just another part of the journey. But we have to stick together. Now help me find Lisa." Something in my voice must have reached him because he nodded, stumbling to his feet. We pushed through the crowd, searching desperately for Lisa's familiar face. We found her near the front of the car, trying to pull other passengers back from the door. "Lisa," I called out. "We have to go." She turned, relief flooding her face when she saw us. "Go where?" she asked as she reached us. "In case you haven't noticed, we're a little short on options here." I pointed towards the back of the train. "We keep going. This thing has to end somewhere. And I don't think it's here." As if in response to my words, I heard the train whistle again, louder this time. The engine was starting up. "It's leaving," Howard said, his eyes wide. "We have to get off now or we'll be trapped forever." I finished for him. "I've got news for you, Howard. We're already trapped. Have been since we first stepped on board. But now we have a chance to find the real way out." Lisa looked at me, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You think this is all part of it, don't you? The final test?" I nodded. "It has to be. And I'm not failing it by giving in now." The train lurched, beginning to move. Around us, the last of the passengers were either fleeing onto the platform or collapsing in despair. "It's now or never," I said. "Are you with me?" Lisa grabbed my hand without hesitation. Howard hesitated for a moment, looking longingly at the door, but then took Lisa's other hand. "All right," he said. "Let's see where this crazy train takes us." As the train picked up speed, we made our way towards the back, pushing against the tide of terrified passengers. The little girl appeared again, her face contorted with rage. "You can't do this," she shrieked. "You have to get off. Everybody gets off." "Not today," I told her, pushing past. We reached the final car just as the platform disappeared from view. Through the windows, we could see only darkness. Not the familiar darkness of night, but an absolute void, empty of all light and substance. The train picked up speed, rattling and shaking more violently than ever before. We huddled together, bracing ourselves against the walls of the car. "What now?" Lisa yelled over the noise. "We wait," I said, "and we don't let go." The darkness outside seemed to press in on us, seeping through the windows like a living thing. The lights in the car flickered and died, plunging us into blackness. I could feel Lisa's hand in mine, Howard's presence at my side, but I couldn't see them. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the shaking stopped. The oppressive darkness lifted, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the train began to slow. Sunlight, real, warm, beautiful sunlight, streamed through the windows. I blinked, my eyes unused to the brightness after so long in the train's artificial light. As my vision cleared, I saw that we were pulling into a station, a real station, with people waiting on the platform, going about their daily lives as if nothing was amiss. The train came to a gentle stop, and the doors opened with a familiar hiss. For a long moment, none of us moved, afraid that this was just another trick, another test. Then Howard let out a whoop of joy and rushed for the door. Lisa and I followed, stepping out onto the platform on shaky legs. The station sign read, Grand Central Terminal. We were in New York. We'd made it. As we stood there, breathless and disbelieving, I felt a tug on my sleeve. I turned to see the little girl with the black eyes. But now, in the sunlight, she looked different. Normal. Just a regular kid with brown eyes and a confused expression. "Excuse me," she said, her voice high and childish. "Is this the train to Chicago?" I knelt down to her level, smiling gently. "No, sweetheart. This train just came from Chicago. But trust me, you don't want to get on it." She nodded, thanked me, and ran off to find her parents. I watched her go, a weight lifting from my chest. Lisa squeezed my hand. "Is it really over?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I looked at her, then at Howard, then at the bustling station around us. "Yeah," I said, finally allowing myself to believe it. "I think it is." As we made our way out of the station and into the bright New York morning, I knew that the memories of our endless journey would stay with us forever. But we had faced the darkness, made our choice, and found our way back to the light. And if I ever saw a train again, it would be too soon. Hopefully, I don't dox myself by writing this, but I'm a graffiti artist, or as some might see it, a delinquent. I'm fine with either title. Point is, I like to spray paint, and I'm decent with a can in my hand. The tagging community is atrocious. People aren't friendly, and there's no respect between artists. Because of this, I've adopted a much more inconspicuous routine. I like tagging up quieter spots, where my art likely won't be seen by other artists or the general public. Old train lines are usually a good bet, since the train cars are endless, and new trains get decommissioned and left to rot on them all the time. My friend Lucas likes to come with me when I tag up, even though he's not big into the whole thing himself. I welcome the company. Some people don't understand the importance of a good friend, and I think that's sad. Most of my other friends don't seem to respect my time or interests as much as he seems to. Lucas and I found ourselves smoking on some nameless set of old tracks I found earlier that day on Google Maps. I'm not a big stoner myself, but he smokes a lot of weed, so I often indulge to match his vibe. It wasn't that late, maybe a little past 10 p.m. We finished AJ and talked as we walked alongside the old, rusty freight train. Oddly enough, there wasn't a single tag on the entire train. It must have been recently moved here, I thought, excited that I'd get first dibs on such a good surface. I tossed Lucas a can for him to mess around with, and I started doing my own thing. About 5 minutes later, I finished my first tag. I admired it for a bit before moving to the next car, then the next. About 15 minutes and 2 paint cans later, I had 3 decent tags up adjacent to one another, and I was pretty proud of myself for how they looked in combination with each other. Sorry in advance if this offends anyone, but I tend to discard my empty cans wherever they go dry. So, I flung them back the way we had come, enjoying the satisfying clattering sound a ball bearing makes when bouncing around the inside of an empty can. I then caught up with Lucas, who had seemingly rolled and lit another joint, neglecting the paint I had given him. For context, the reason I'm not a big stoner is because I started getting unbearable anxiety highs much more frequently, maybe 90% of the time. In hindsight, smoking 2 Js with Lucas was a borderline detrimental decision. After all, we were doing something illegal, which was already pretty anxiety-inducing. I smoked the second joint anyway, confident that I'd be okay. As soon as the final sparks floated off the J, that's when we heard it. A muffled clang from somewhere behind us rang out into the night. The two of us froze and stared into the darkness. I could feel droplets of sweat forming around my neck as adrenaline began coursing through me. I couldn't tell if the sound had come from outside of the train or from inside one of the cars. It was hard to tell which option was worse. We waited for a full minute in silence, and nothing. That's when I whipped out my phone and recorded this video. As the video shows, whoever made that noise picked up one of my empty paint cans and threw it at us, before chasing and shouting at us. You can't really see the paint can in the video, but I swear to you, that's what the first sound was. As we frantically made our escape, whoever was behind us yelled, "You better not trip, boy." A few seconds later, an actual gunshot sounded off behind us, almost causing Lucas to trip and fall. It startled me so much that my fingers slipped off the record button on Snapchat, and the video cut out. We bolted down the tracks until they intersected a main road, and didn't stop running until we were a safe distance away. I don't think I've ever been more terrified in my entire life. It didn't help that I was stoned out of my mind. My hands were literally shaking. So were Lucas's. We found our way back to the car and drove home in silence. What was I supposed to do, call the police? I was literally breaking the law. That wasn't an option. The story doesn't end there, though. I actually went back to those tracks a few weeks later, but this time during the day and equipped with my trusty Glock 17. To my surprise, the train was still there. Despite that, there was a pretty glaring difference this time around. In the 3 spots where my tags had previously been were now ugly blotches of red paint. Someone had deliberately covered my work. Quietly, I kept investigating and eventually came to a train car with its door wide open. I took a look inside and it was bizarre. The train car was completely empty, except for a chair in the direct center and what looked like ropes and chains scattered about. Some of the ropes were wrapped around the legs of the chair, and others were just lying on the floor. The weirdest part was the smell, though. The whole car smelled like bleach. If you closed your eyes, you would have guessed you were in a cleaning supply closet. I can't overstate the smell, though. It literally smelled like the whole train car had been doused in bleach. I went to take a picture of the scene when I thought I heard a metal clang somewhere further down the train. I could have imagined it, but I wasn't taking any chances. That was enough for me. I was out of there as quickly as I had come. I've told so many people this story, and none of them could rationalize that psycho's actions in a way that makes sense. I doubt a homeless person would be able to get their hands on a gun, but I can't fathom why someone other than a homeless person would respond so aggressively, and why they decided to cover up my tags as another mystery. I think the most disturbing aspect of this whole thing was the chair in the middle of the train car. I really want to go back to those tracks just to take a picture of what I saw, but I haven't worked up the courage to. I have no idea if whoever was there that night was really shooting to kill us or just trying to scare us, but sometimes late at night, when it's just me and my thoughts, I can still hear that shot ringing in my ears. As I'm writing this, it's early July. This story took place at the beginning of summer. I usually try to hang around my college town or travel to Europe in the summer as a way to avoid going home, but that wasn't a possibility this time around. I found myself reluctantly returning home at the beginning of the summer. I just had to make it through 1 week, and then I'd be on a plane to Germany. I didn't really feel like seeing any of my old friends, but I wasn't too keen on staying home either. I found myself waking up early and spending my entire days hiking, watching movies, or even just driving around aimlessly. It was my last day home. I was getting bored of the stuff I had been doing and wanted to do something a little more exciting. My friends and I used to train hop, one of the many unruly activities that I had since cut out of my life. I decided, what the hell, and drove to a secluded set of tracks I knew about. Freight trains always passed through here, so I knew there would be many options. The tracks were surrounded by trees and various flora, part of the reason I had chosen them. The last thing I needed was to be caught for doing an illegal activity after having been clean for so many years. I parked my car and made my way over to the tracks. Let me describe the layout so it's easy to understand. This specific set of tracks ran through the trees for a while before entering a tunnel. There was a very small clearing on the other side of the tunnel, and then a massive bridge over the water. My friends and I used to ride the train all the way across the bridge, but since it was just me, I would have no way of getting back to my car unless I felt like walking 10 miles. So I decided that I'd hop on the train and take it through the tunnel, hop off, and get a peaceful walk back to my car. I walked along the tracks and waited for a train to pass. It was probably 2 or 3 in the afternoon. Finally, after about 10 minutes of walking, I started to feel the familiar vibration in the rails. I quickly ran to the side and tried my best to stay out of sight. Usually, as far as I know, freight train conductors didn't care enough to report people walking along the tracks, but I didn't want to take any chances. The train passed, and I waited for a good amount of cars to go by before emerging from my hiding spot. I picked a car that looked easily attainable and began jogging alongside the train like I had done 100 times before. Once I was confident enough, I grabbed hold of the ladder and swung myself up. It was pretty easy. The train wasn't traveling very quickly. As my part of the train was about to enter the tunnel, I saw a strange flash of light from up ahead. I assumed it was a spark from the train or something, but truth be told, I had never seen anything like it before. I hoped there wasn't an errant wire or something dangerous in the tunnel, but it was too late to hop off. The train started picking up speed since the tunnel was perfectly straight, and I closed my eyes as the adrenaline rush started coming on. Just then, I felt a hand reach out from the darkness and literally grab my leg. I lost my footing and nearly slipped, but my hands were firmly gripping the train. I screamed and kicked, but the train sped by before I could make contact with anything. Before I could even comprehend what just happened, I felt another hand slap against my leg. I screamed again before scrambling up the ladder, hopefully out of reach. My heart was racing. What the hell just happened? The train exited the tunnel, and I hopped off without thinking. I waited for the train to completely pass and watched it chug over the bridge. I remember pacing back and forth in the little clearing, thinking about what just happened. Like, were there really people in the tunnel, and what could they possibly be doing there? Why the hell would they try to drag me down? All of these thoughts, and more, were racing through my mind when a stark realization struck me in the face. The only way back to my car was through the tunnel. There was absolutely no chance in hell I was walking back through that tunnel with those people in there, especially since they'd be able to see my silhouette and I'd be walking through darkness. I sat on the ground for what felt like forever. There was no other option. I couldn't walk across the bridge without risking my life. A train could come along at any second, and the bridge was too long. I considered calling someone to come rescue me, but I wasn't even sure if they'd be able to do anything. Police weren't an option. I was breaking the law just being here. I had no choice. I picked up a rock and started making my way through the tunnel. There were 2 people in there, which I knew for a fact, but there could have been more. I had no idea. I got about halfway to the point where I felt the second set of hands when I heard something. A faint clicking was coming from somewhere in the tunnel. It sounded like a human clicking their tongue, but it could have been made by a machine. It was honestly hard to tell. I froze and thought to myself, continuing to walk this tunnel was a death sentence. I felt a rush of confidence and pulled out my phone. "You better stay back or I'll shoot," I threatened, my words echoing off the tunnel walls. There was a moment of silence. The clicking stopped as quickly as it had begun. I was obviously bluffing about having a gun, but I figured it was better to bluff than just walk in silence. I then pulled up a video on YouTube of a gunshot sound effect, turned up my phone's volume, and played it. It was honestly louder than I was expecting, and with the echo of the tunnel, I prayed to God that whoever was in there bought it. Without waiting another second, I sprinted full speed into the darkness, bracing myself for a fight. I didn't stop running until I had reached the other side. By some miracle, no one tried to grab me. After making it out of the tunnel, I looked back. There was another flash from deep in the tunnel. This time, though, it subsided long enough for me to clearly see 2 silhouettes standing on the tracks facing me. That was it for me. I turned to leave. But as I was jogging away, the nastiest screech I've ever heard emanated from the tunnel. It sounded barbaric. Definitely human, but far from normal. I don't plan on ever train hopping again. The New York City subway system is a scary place. I've been an MTA worker for 7 years, and nothing really surprises me anymore. When friends and family ask if I have any stories, though, there is one that stands out among the rest. One that I can't explain. This happened to me about 2 years into the job, but I remember it like it was yesterday. I was pretty acclimated to everything at that point, and things had become routine. I was stationed in Brooklyn at the time, and I was doing some routine maintenance in High Street Station. There wasn't a soul on the platform. It was actually kind of eerie. You're used to these subway stations overflowing with people, so seeing them empty and almost deserted looking was a strange adjustment to make. I hadn't seen a person on the platform in hours, and it was dead silent except for the buzz of the lights and the occasional passing train. Out of nowhere, I heard a clang from somewhere down the track. It startled me so badly that I dropped my mop in shock. The sound wasn't something I was used to hearing. The best way I could describe it to you is that sound that a rock would make if it had been dropped on a metal rail. I stopped what I was doing and looked into the tunnel, listening for other noises. After a while, I concluded that whatever I heard had either been caused by an animal or a falling piece of cement. After all, these stations were pretty old. I went back to work, not thinking too much about the sound. About 10 minutes later, the same sound shook me from my concentration, only this time it was probably about twice as loud. This time, I actually became a little concerned, dare I say scared. Was it really possible that 2 chunks of the ceiling had fallen in the span of 10 minutes? I put down my supplies and walked over to the tunnel entrance, trying to be quiet. I peered into the darkness and couldn't really see anything. I debated whether or not it was a good idea to call out into the tunnel and ultimately decided against it. I still figured it was nothing, but after the initial fear had worn off, I was more confused than anything. I kept trying to think of things that could make a sound like that, not once, but twice. It was especially bizarre since the second sound was louder. I tried to keep my mind off the sounds and went back to work, finding a good rhythm again. I was almost done with my work on this platform and was pleased that I'd get to leave this weird station soon. As I was wrapping things up, I heard something that gave me the chills. A child's voice called out for help from inside the tunnel, and he sounded like he was in distress. I instantly stopped what I was doing and made my way over to the edge of the platform. I hesitated for a few seconds before deciding that a child in anguish wasn't something my moral conscience would allow me to ignore. I walked down the steps leading onto the tracks and waited for my eyes to adjust to the darkness. I shouted into the tunnel, asking that kid if he was okay. No response. That's weird, I thought, starting to feel nervous about this encounter. Just then, The kid's voice rang out again, repeating his call for help. I yelled back, asking him if he could hear me. He responded yes, and I asked where specifically he was. There was a brief moment of silence before he just said, "In front of you. Just keep walking." I really didn't want to, but couldn't just leave some helpless kid all alone on those tracks. It was dangerous. I began walking forward when something dawned on me. I yelled into the darkness one more time, this time asking the kid what was wrong. An uncomfortable pause again before the kid responded, "Just keep walking." I didn't like that. This whole thing was off. My eyes finally adjusted to the darkness, and I was able to slightly make out what was in front of me. There actually was what looked like the shadow of a kid just up the tracks, but there was something else that almost made me scream in fear. Another shadow, this one much taller, obviously an adult. My blood ran cold, and I stopped in place. This wasn't happening to me. As slowly as I could, I turned around and made my way back to the platform. Luckily, I wasn't chased on the way back. The kid shouted, "Wait, where are you going?" Once I reached the platform, but I wasn't sticking around another second. I made my way up the stairs and called the police as soon as I got cell service. I told them everything, and police were swarming the platform in a matter of minutes. I waited to see what they turned up. After about 20 minutes of searching, they did find something chilling. There was a single kid's shoe just lying in the tunnel, which the police hypothesized could have signified a struggle. After hours more of searching and scouring every available database for missing children, we were told we'd receive a call if anything ever came up. It was concluded that whoever had been down there, though, had hidden somewhere in the tunnels. I have no idea what to think of this experience. This is the best theory I can come up with. Some psycho kidnapped a child and forced him to yell for help in an attempt to lure some unsuspecting Good Samaritan into a trap. Or hell, maybe it's their own kid who they're raising to also be a psycho. I can't think of any other reasonable explanation besides this one. But if I'm right, I can only imagine what that kid must be going through.